What if the place meant to keep you safe becomes the prison you can never escape? Quinn Avery thought he was just a lost soul passing through a forgotten motel, until he was bound by a dark legacy that traps the living and the dead alike. Every door hides a nightmare. Every echo whispers a regret, and the line between reality and terror fades with every step. Will Quinn stand as the keeper of the motel's haunted threshold, or will he become another lost echo, swallowed by the shadows forever? Welcome to a story where fear is a choice, and survival is only the beginning. I don't know what the hell I was thinking when I decided to drive across New Mexico alone. Maybe I thought I needed to find myself. Or maybe I just wanted to run from the suffocating familiarity of my old life in Denver. The cubicle job, the hollow friendships, the ex who still texted at 2 a.m. just to remind me she existed. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, bleeding out in shades of violet and blood orange across the desert sky. I had the window down, letting the warm wind slap my face. A cheap attempt to stay awake as my phone's GPS insisted on a shortcut, a road so empty it felt like I was driving on the surface of the moon. My name is Quinn Avery, 26, lost, angry, and desperate enough to think that this road trip might somehow stitch my broken pieces back together. But that night, the desert wasn't interested in healing me. It wanted to eat me alive. I remember the first sputter of the engine. At first, I thought I imagined it, the radio static mixing with the low hum of the tires over cracked asphalt. But then the dashboard lights flickered. Once, twice, then darkness. I pulled over as the car gasped its final breath. Dead silence swallowed me, broken only by the faint ticking of the cooling engine. I stepped out and immediately felt the weight of the night press down on me. The desert is a different kind of dark, an oppressive blackness that feels like it has hands reaching for you. In the distance, cacti stood like silent sentinels, shadows twisting into grotesque shapes in my mind. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course. I leaned against the car and laughed. It was the kind of laugh that edges dangerously close to crying. I felt small, microscopic even, surrounded by miles and miles of nothing. Then I saw it. A flicker of light, almost like a small candle, far down the road. I squinted, my eyes straining. It wasn't headlights, no. It was too soft, too human. I grabbed my backpack and started walking, each step echoing in the infinite silence. The closer I got, the more the light revealed itself. A flickering neon sign that read Sand Echo Motel, buzzing weakly like an insect caught in a jar. The building looked like it had been spit out of a different era. Faded turquoise paint, cracked windows, and a diner attached to one side. A single rusty gas pump stood nearby, its hose coiled like a dead snake. A shiver slid down my spine, but I forced myself forward. Anything was better than dying of dehydration on the side of the road. The bell above the door chimed weakly as I stepped into the lobby. The air smelled like burnt coffee and old wood, with a hint of something sweeter and rotten lurking underneath. Behind the counter stood an old woman. Her hair was silver and pinned neatly behind her head. Her eyes, pale green and sharp, flicked up at me, immediately reading me like an open book. "Well, you took your sweet time," she rasped, as if she'd been expecting me all along. I swallowed. "My car broke down. I need help. Maybe a room for the night?" She tilted her head slowly, her gaze unwavering. "You're not from around here." "No," I said, my voice thin. She studied me for a moment longer, then pushed a large brass key across the counter. The tag read Room 6. "Name's Eileen," she said. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll see about your car." I wanted to ask questions, so many. But her eyes told me this wasn't a woman who entertained small talk. "Thanks," I murmured, taking the key. My fingers brushed hers for a split second. Ice cold, almost inhumanly so. "Rules," she added suddenly, her voice sharp. "You'll find a list on the nightstand. You will read them. You will follow them. No exceptions." I hesitated. "Rules?" Eileen only stared, her lips curling into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I nodded, my throat dry. "Okay." The hallway stretched before me, narrow and dimly lit by flickering wall sconces. I passed closed doors, each one with a tarnished number plate. I felt them watching me somehow, like each door held its own breath, waiting for me to do something stupid. When I reached room 6, I slipped inside and turned on the light. The room was small, bed, dresser, a single nightstand with a cracked lamp. The curtains were heavy, deep red, and smelled faintly of dust and old tobacco. On the nightstand sat a piece of paper, yellowed and curled at the edges. At the top, handwritten in a spidery scrawl, it read, "Rules for guests. Keep the hallway light on at all times after sunset. Do not open your door if you hear knocking after 3 a.m. Do not look out the window between midnight and sunrise. Always leave a tip on the dresser before you leave the room, even if you're coming back. Never, under any circumstances, enter room 9. I read them again and again. My heartbeat thumped against my ribs like a wild animal. I tried to laugh it off. Motel gimmicks, backwater traditions. But my gut told me something else. I took a quick shower, keeping my eyes on the ground the entire time, half expecting something to crawl out of the drain. When I finally collapsed onto the bed, I left the hallway light on, just as instructed. My eyelids were heavy, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the old building felt like footsteps. Every rustle of the wind felt like a whisper brushing against my ear. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to a soft knock. 3 knocks, exactly. I shot upright, my heart in my throat. The clock on the nightstand glowed red. 3:04 a.m. I held my breath. Another 3 knocks, then a low, dragging sound, like someone running a hand slowly down my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, clenching the sheets until my knuckles turned white. I repeated the rules in my mind like a prayer. Do not open the door. Do not open the door. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. The hallway light flickered once, twice, then glowed steady again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, I finally exhaled, feeling my entire body ache with tension. I had no idea what I'd stepped into, but something told me this motel wasn't just a place to rest your head. It was a crossroads, and whether I liked it or not, I had just taken the first step into its heart. The morning felt like it belonged to another lifetime. When I finally stepped out of room 6, the hallway was eerily still. The light above buzzed softly, but it felt more like a sickly heartbeat than actual illumination. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow slipping just out of view. I carried the paper with the rules folded in my pocket, my fingers constantly brushing against it like a talisman. I walked into the diner, which was attached directly to the lobby. The inside looked like a postcard from 1963. Checkerboard floor, faded turquoise booths, a row of bar stools along the counter. An old jukebox stood silent in the corner, its song list sun-bleached and cracked. Behind the counter stood a man I hadn't met last night, late 40s maybe, sunburned skin, deep lines etched into his face. His hair was dark and tied back, and his eyes were a warm brown, but with a faraway glaze, like he was permanently seeing something just beyond this world. He turned to me as if he'd already been expecting me. "Morning," he grunted. Morning?" I managed, sliding awkwardly onto a bar stool. He reached under the counter, pulled out a chipped mug, and poured coffee so black it looked like motor oil. He pushed it toward me without a word. "Thanks," I said, taking a cautious sip. It was bitter as sin, but at least it was hot. "Name's Mateo," he finally said. His voice was low, almost melodic in a tired sort of way. "You're the new stray." I winced at the word. "I guess I am." Mateo wiped down the counter with a rag that had probably seen more horror stories than I ever wanted to know. "You meet Eileen yet?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "She gave me the rules." Mateo let out a dry laugh, no humor behind it. "You actually followed them?" I nodded. "Good," he said simply. "Most don't. Most think they're just superstitions, until they hear the knocks." I swallowed hard. "You've heard them too?" He stopped wiping. His eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. "Stina Sabanek," he said, "every night," he said quietly. "Some doors you don't open, kid. Some doors stay shut forever." We fell into silence. The diner around us felt frozen in time. Sunlight spilled across the booths, but didn't seem to warm the place. Eventually, Mateo pointed to a faded menu taped to the wall. "You hungry?" I glanced at it. The items were almost all scratched out except for house breakfast, coffee, and dessert pie. "I'll just have the breakfast," I said. Mateo shuffled into the back kitchen. I sat there, trying to shake off the leftover fear from the night before. My mind kept replaying the knocks at 3 a.m., the slow dragging sound against my door. When Mateo returned, he set down a plate of eggs, bacon, and 2 pieces of toast. It looked surprisingly normal, like something you'd get at a roadside cafe anywhere in America. I dug in, hoping the food might ground me somehow. "Your car." Mateo spoke up again from the kitchen doorway. "We'll check on it later, but you should know, nobody leaves here by accident." I paused mid-bite. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, the front door creaked open. A man stepped inside. He looked wrong. His clothes were outdated, like something from the 1940s. Suspenders, a pale dress shirt, and slacks that were dust-caked and torn. But it wasn't the clothes that stopped me cold. It was his face. Or rather, the lack of it. His features seemed smudged, as if someone had taken an eraser to a portrait. Vague hints of eyes and a mouth, but no real detail, just a shifting, blurry emptiness. Mateo didn't move. He just nodded toward me, as if to say, "Stay put." The faceless man walked slowly, each step echoing too loudly on the diner floor. He slid into a booth in the far corner. Mateo grabbed a glass of water and a piece of paper, then walked it over. He placed it gently in front of the figure and backed away like he was feeding a wild animal. I watched, frozen, as the figure placed both hands on the table and bowed its head slightly. The room temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. I could see my breath for a split second. "Don't stare," Mateo hissed quietly when he returned behind the counter. "They don't like it." I turned my gaze down to my plate, my fork shaking slightly in my hand. What is that?" I whispered. Mateo sighed, glancing toward the figure before answering. "Drifters, lost ones, souls that never found their way past the veil. This place, it's not just a motel. It's a stopover." "A stopover for what?" I felt the words clawing out of my throat. "For whatever comes after," he said simply. I felt my skin tighten, goosebumps rising on my arms. The reality of where I had landed, or been led to, began to dawn on me in a slow, creeping horror. Suddenly, the jukebox in the corner flickered to life. A scratchy, old tune filled the air, something jazzy, off-key, haunted. The faceless man stood, placed a coin on the table, and shuffled out without a sound. The door closed behind him, and instantly the temperature in the room warmed again. I exhaled sharply, realizing I had been holding my breath. Mateo placed a hand on my shoulder, heavy and warm. "You followed the rules last night. That's good, but there are more than just written rules here, kid. There are deeper laws, ones you feel in your bones." I turned to look at him. Why me? Why am I here? His eyes softened for a moment. "Because you can see them, you can feel them. Not everyone can. They get lost in the desert, but they don't all make it here. You did." A cold realization washed over me. I wasn't just lost in the literal sense. I was lost in a way that attracted this place, this hidden, rotting heart in the middle of nowhere. Before I could say anything else, the kitchen door swung open. Eileen stood there, her silhouette sharp and imposing against the backlight. "Quinn," she called, her voice slicing through the diner like a blade. "After breakfast, we'll talk. You have obligations now." I sat alone, surrounded by the echo of that haunted jazz tune, the taste of cold eggs on my tongue, and a dread so deep it felt like an ocean was opening beneath my feet. When I finished the last cold, rubbery bite of my breakfast, my mind felt like it had been dropped into a meat grinder. I didn't know what scared me more: Eileen's sudden command, Mateo's cryptic warnings, or the faceless man who had shuffled through the diner like a smudge from a nightmare. I pushed open the swinging door behind the counter, the hinges squealing like an injured animal. The kitchen smelled of scorched bacon and something more primal, a sour tang that clung to the back of my throat. Eileen stood near the back door, a cigarette burning between her fingers. She looked out across the endless flat land, the smoke curling up around her like spectral fingers. "Close the door," she said without turning. I did as she asked. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain she could hear it. She took a long drag, exhaled, then finally turned her gaze to me. Her pale eyes seemed to pin me to the spot, as if dissecting me cell by cell. "You've seen them now," she said, voice rough like gravel. "The drifters, the lost ones." I swallowed, trying to find words. "I didn't. I don't understand what they are, or what this place is." Eileen flicked ash onto the floor, her expression unreadable. "Most people don't see the truth, Quinn. They drift through life blind, happy to believe what they're told. But you're different. You see them. You feel the edges." I shifted uncomfortably. "Why me?" She ignored my question. Instead, she walked to an old metal cabinet in the corner and yanked it open. Inside was a collection of objects that looked like they belonged in a witch's shrine. Small animal bones tied together with red string, glass jars filled with black sand, feathers, teeth. She pulled out a small object wrapped in leather and held it out to me. "Take it." I hesitated before stepping forward. When I unwrapped it, I found a smooth, gray stone, carved with swirling patterns that seemed to shimmer when I turned it in the light. "The vision stone," Aileen said. "It helps you see what really is, not just what your mind wants to see." I turned it over in my hands, the weight somehow heavier than it should have been. "You will need it tonight," she continued, "and every night after, if you choose to stay." "Choose?" I barked a humorless laugh. "I don't remember being given a choice." Eileen's eyes flashed dangerously. "There is always a choice, but freedom has a cost here, a steep one." I felt a coldness spread through me, like ice crackling through my veins. "What happens if I leave?" She tilted her head. "You can leave. The road is right there. But if you do, you will be claimed. By what waits in the desert? The ones that knock, the collector." The name hung in the air like a bad smell. "The collector," I echoed, the words tasting rotten in my mouth. Eileen snuffed her cigarette out on the concrete floor. "Comes when the veil is thin. He collects what's owed. Souls, lives, debts, sometimes all at once." I glanced at the vision stone again, the carvings seeming to swirl faster now, as if reacting to my panic. "You mean tonight?" I said. "He's coming tonight?" Eileen gave a slow, grim nod. "The moon will be full, not just full blue, a blue moon. The veil between worlds will thin to a single breath." I stumbled back against the counter, bile rising in my throat. "What do you want from me?" I gasped. She stepped forward, closing the distance between us in a blink. Her face was inches from mine now. "You have the blood, Quinn. You have the sight. You can reinforce the boundary, or you can run and let it all collapse. Watch the desert swallow everything." I shook my head violently, trying to deny the reality pressing down on me like a physical weight. "You're insane," I spat. "This is all insane." Eileen's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was shockingly strong for her frail frame. "Look," she hissed. She pressed my hand around the vision stone and forced it up toward my eye. I didn't want to see. Every cell in my body screamed to pull away, but it was too late. Through the stone, the world shifted. The walls peeled back like old wallpaper, revealing a web of pulsing veins, black as midnight, snaking through the motel. Shadows crawled along the floors and ceilings, clawing at each other, their mouths open in silent wails. Beyond them, I saw the desert, but not the one I'd driven through. This desert was alive, heaving and breathing like a massive sleeping animal. Figures moved across it, hundreds of them, twisted and faceless like the man from the diner. And in the distance, towering above them all, was a shape I could barely comprehend, a thing with 1,000 arms, each one ending in long, hooked fingers. Its face shimmered and flickered, impossible to focus on, but I could feel its gaze turn toward me. I fell backward, the stone slipping from my hand and skittering across the floor. My vision returned, but the imprint of what I'd seen burned behind my eyelids. Eileen let go and stepped back, her expression almost sympathetic. "Now you know," she said softly. "Now you understand why the rules matter." I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving. "I didn't ask for this," I shouted. "I don't want any of this." Eileen tilted her head, a sad smile playing at the edges of her lips. "None of us did." She turned and opened the back door, letting the blinding midday sun flood the room. "You have until sundown to decide," she said. "Stay and fight, or run and be claimed." She stepped out into the light, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I stood there, trembling, my breath ragged. I looked down at the vision stone lying on the floor, the pattern still shifting slowly like a heartbeat. Outside, I could hear the low hum of the desert wind, but beneath it, something else. A faint, almost melodic whisper, like a choir of lost souls calling my name. "Quinn, Quinn, Quinn." I closed my eyes, feeling the heat from the doorway on my skin, and for the first time, I wondered if there was ever really a choice at all. I don't remember leaving the kitchen. One moment I was standing there, vision stone at my feet, heart pounding out a death march. The next, I was stumbling into the parking lot, the sun searing down like a god's open eye. The world looked normal again. The cracked asphalt shimmered with heat waves. The rusted gas pump still slumped next to the sign that read, Desert Motel, letters peeling like old skin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at a cheap mask stretched over something much, much worse. I felt the stone's imprint burning into my palm, even though I wasn't holding it anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure in the distance, that thing with 1,000 hooked arms reaching across the horizon. Mateo was standing near the gas pump, smoking. The cigarette glowed bright against the endless pale sky. He looked up at me as if he'd been waiting there forever. "You look like shit," he said. I opened my mouth, but my voice came out cracked and dry. "You knew," I rasped. "You knew what this place really is." He took a slow drag, exhaled, and gave me a long, heavy look. "Kid, if I told you everything day one, you would have run straight into the desert and never come back." I stared at him, the words crashing into me like waves against rocks. "What is the collector? What does he want?" Mateo flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "The collector isn't just a he, it's a hunger, a law older than dirt. The desert's debt collector. It feeds on lost souls, on unkept promises, on the weak points between worlds." He stepped closer, and I caught a sharp scent, something earthy and ancient, like sage burned in an old ritual. "When people break the rules," he continued, "when they don't follow the boundaries, it opens cracks. The collector slides through. It doesn't care if you're a good person or a piece of shit. It just collects." My mind reeled. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up in my bed back in Denver, hungover and hating my life, but alive. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mateo's eyes softened, a flicker of pity, or maybe regret. "Because you can see," he said. "Because your family line carries the old sight, the ability to sense the crossings, the echoes. That's rare, and that makes you a magnet for this place." A tremor ran through me. "So what? I'm supposed to just stay here? Be some kind of guardian?" Mateo nodded solemnly. "Someone has to hold the line. Someone has to keep the veil intact." I shook my head, backing away until I bumped into the hood of my dead car. "No, no, there has to be another way." He sighed, rubbing a hand across his weathered face. I tried to leave once too, thought I could outrun it, drove for miles until I ran out of gas. By the time I realized I was back at the same pump, I felt my stomach churn. The motel wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a spider's web spun across the desert. Before I could argue, the air shifted. The dry, baking heat seemed to pause, replaced by a sudden electric charge. The sky above shimmered like hot oil, and the distant horizon rippled, revealing thin, sneaking shadows crawling toward us. Mateo turned sharply, his hand gripping my shoulder so hard I winced. "They're early," he hissed. "We don't have time." I followed his gaze and felt my mouth go dry. Figures moved across the desert, silhouettes shambling and twitching, their outlines blurred like old film reels. "Inside," Mateo ordered, pushing me toward the motel entrance. I stumbled through the door, nearly crashing into Eileen, who stood waiting, eyes wild and glassy. "He's coming sooner than expected," she snapped. "We need to prepare now." She thrust the vision stone back into my hand. It throbbed against my skin like a second heartbeat. "Take it," she barked. "Tonight, you'll either anchor this place or it'll devour you." I wanted to drop the stone, to run until my lungs bled, but my fingers closed around it against my will. Eileen grabbed a rusty tin can from a shelf and began shaking what looked like black sand onto the floor in a wide circle. Mateo joined her, chanting in a low, guttural voice that vibrated deep in my bones. I hovered on the edge of the diner, half caught between bolting for the door and collapsing in place. "Quinn!" Elin shouted, snapping me back. "Stand in the circle!" I stepped forward, my legs shaking so hard I thought they might buckle. As soon as I crossed the boundary of black sand, a jolt surged up through my feet, like plunging into icy water. "Focus!" she commanded, her voice echoing strangely. "See past the mask." I raised the stone, hesitating. My pulse roared in my ears. I could taste metal on my tongue. Then I looked. The walls of the diner dissolved into veins and black tendrils, writhing like eels in a jar. Shadows slithered across the floor, coiling around my ankles and sliding up my spine. Through the windows, the desert appeared alive, roiling and rippling with faceless figures clawing at the glass, whispering in a chorus of grief and hunger. And behind them, the collector loomed. Its 1,000 arms scraped the sky, its face a shifting void that swallowed light. My vision blurred, and I felt a scream tear through my throat, soundless, endless. Mateo's voice rose, chanting faster, each word a hammer strike against my mind. Eileen poured a circle of black sand tighter around me, her hands trembling. "You hold the line," she shrieked. "You decide if they cross or stay damned forever." I felt my knees give, but I didn't fall. Instead, something inside me snapped open. A raw, blistering surge of energy that crashed through my chest like a lightning bolt. The collector's arms twitched, pausing mid-reach. The faceless crowd pressed against the windows, their moans echoing in my skull. I gripped the stone tighter, the carvings cutting into my skin. Blood trickled down my wrist, and where it touched the sand, it hissed and turned to steam. Eileen's eyes locked on mine, wide and frantic. "It's your choice, Quinn. Bind them or be taken," I screamed, the sound finally breaking free, shaking the walls. The visions flickered, the shadows recoiling as if slapped. Somewhere inside that chaos, I realized this was never just about the motel, or the collector, or even my bloodline. It was about me, whether I would run or whether I would stand. The scream ripped through my throat like barbed wire, echoing off the diner walls and rolling out into the desert like a wave of raw defiance. Outside, the collector's 1,000 arms paused mid-air, claws curling and twitching as if trying to decide whether to strike or retreat. The faceless drifters at the windows pressed harder against the glass, their blank heads tilting, their fingers tapping in a syncopated rhythm that rattled my teeth. I could hear them now, really hear them. "Help me. Let us in. We're so cold, we're so hungry." Each voice carried a story, a final regret, a lost promise, and each one clawed at the softest parts of me, tugging at my guilt, my loneliness, my anger. Eileen's voice cracked through the storm like a lightning bolt. "Quinn, hold it steady. Don't give in." But her words were distant, muffled, like she was shouting from the bottom of a well. I felt my feet sink deeper into the black sand circle. My blood still dripped from my hand, sizzling where it touched the floor, creating spirals of steam that rose like ghostly fingers. The vision stone in my palm pulsed with a heat so intense I thought it might fuse to my flesh. My fingers locked around it, bones grinding, but I couldn't let go. Then, like a crack splitting a dam, I felt something in me fracture. A flood of images rushed into my skull. My father's disappointed eyes as he watched me quit another job. My mother's silent tears when I left home without saying goodbye. My ex's venom-laced text messages telling me I was nothing, that I'd never be enough. We're so hungry, let us in. You don't deserve to keep us out. I felt my knees buckle. The black tendrils slithered up my legs, winding around my waist, pushing cold fingers under my ribs. For a moment, I almost wanted to let go, but then I saw something. A flicker, a memory that wasn't mine. A young woman, her hair the same dark brown as mine, standing in the same diner decades ago. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed her own blood into the sand circle, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Eileen. I saw her fall to her knees as the collector's shape loomed beyond the glass, its arms already clawing at the edge of reality. And then, another figure stepped forward, a young man. His features were fuzzy, but something about the curve of his jaw, the shape of his hands, he looked like me. He grabbed Eileen, held her steady, and together they forced the collector back beyond the horizon, sealing the cracks with their shared sacrifice. Eileen had done this before. She hadn't just survived, she had chosen to stay. A surge of anger ignited in my chest, anger at this place, at the universe that decided I was disposable, at myself for always running. I roared, forcing my legs straight, digging my heels into the burning sand. My hands rose, lifting the stone high above my head like an offering. The collector shrieked, a sound so high and sharp it felt like it would flay the inside of my skull. The faceless ones began slamming their palms against the windows, cracks spidering across the glass. Eileen was next to me now, chanting words I couldn't understand. Her voice rose and fell in a primal rhythm, echoing in the bones of the building. Mateo knelt beside us, holding a long rusted knife. Without hesitation, he dragged the blade across his forearm, blood flowing in a thick, dark ribbon onto the sand. Quen, Mateo barked, his voice raw and ragged. We give our regrets, our shame, our failures. That's the price. The collector's shape began to blur, its arms convulsing like a nest of serpents. Its void face turned toward me fully now, and I felt its gaze scrape through my mind, peeling back every lie I'd ever told myself. You are nothing. You are empty. Let go. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But something deep, buried so far down it felt like another life, sparked. A single memory. Me as a kid, standing in a driveway, holding my dad's hand, as we watched 4th of July fireworks. The colors exploded above us, and for one fleeting moment, I believed the world was beautiful and endless and that I had a place in it. I held on to that. I pressed my bleeding hand into the sand, screaming as the stone's carvings flared white-hot. My blood poured into the circle, mixing with Mateo's, with Eileen's old scars and old sacrifices. The collector's scream turned into a wail, a thunderous, endless sob that rolled out into the dead. The drifters at the windows shrank back, melting into the dark, one by one. The shadows slithering up my legs shrieked, turning to ash against my skin. My vision went white, then black, then exploded into 1,000 kaleidoscopic fragments, and then silence. I collapsed forward, face first into the sand circle, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface. My ears rang, my hands felt scorched, my veins screamed with each heartbeat. When I looked up, the diner was whole again. The windows were intact. The collector's shape had dissolved into the empty desert night. The horizon beyond glowed with a pale, sickly moonlight, but no arms reached across it now. Eileen was on her knees, her head bowed. Mateo leaned against the counter, sweat streaming down his face, his eyes wide and wild but alive. I crawled toward Eileen, my throat raw. Did Did we do it? She lifted her head slowly, a weak smile breaking across her cracked lips. You did it, she croaked. You held the line. Mateo let out a bark of exhausted laughter, then collapsed to the floor, his back hitting the wall with a dull thud. The air smelled of blood and burnt ozone. The diner's neon lights buzzed softly, flickering back to life one by one, as if waking from a bad dream. I rolled onto my back, staring at the ceiling, every muscle shaking. I had wanted to run. I had wanted to disappear into the desert and let it all consume me, but for once, I hadn't. I had stood. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a long, mournful note that echoed across the dark sands. I let the sound wash over me, feeling something inside shift. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the fragile illusion of it. Either way, I was still here. For now. I don't know how long I lay there on the diner floor, staring up at the cracked ceiling tiles. My body felt like a battlefield, every inch aching, burned and soaked in cold sweat. My throat was raw, my head pounded with each slow, echoing heartbeat. I wanted to sleep. God, I wanted to close my eyes and vanish into the blackness, but sleep wouldn't come. When I finally pushed myself up, the world around me felt muffled, like I was underwater. The diner lights flickered lazily overhead, casting long, wavering shadows. Each buzz of the neon sign outside felt like a wasp trapped inside my skull. Mateo sat slumped against the counter, his head tilted back, eyes half closed. His shirt clung to his chest, soaked in sweat and blood, but he was breathing, shallow and uneven but alive. Eileen knelt by the window, her forehead resting against the glass. Her shoulders shook with each ragged breath. In the glow of the neon lights, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Frail, almost breakable. I forced myself to crawl over to her, my arms trembling with the effort. "Eileen," I croaked, my voice sounding like gravel dragged over rusted metal. She didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were wet, red-rimmed, but there was something else there too. Pride, relief, maybe even love. "You did it," she whispered. "You held him back. You kept the breach closed." I swallowed hard, tasting blood and smoke on my tongue. "We did it," I corrected. She gave a soft, broken laugh, shaking her head. "No, Quinn. We couldn't have done it without you. You were the key." The last piece. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I was no savior, that I had almost given in, that I had wanted to. Instead, I leaned my forehead against the window beside hers. Outside, the desert looked quiet again, an endless sea of dark sand, rippling under the moonlight. No faceless drifters, no writhing shadows, just emptiness stretching in every direction. A single coyote stood at the edge of the parking lot, its eyes glowing green in the moonlight. It watched us in absolute silence before turning and trotting back into the night. Eileen's hand found mine, her skin cold and paper thin. "The collector will come again," she said softly. "He always does. But for now, the boundary holds." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "And next time?" She squeezed my hand weakly. "Next time you'll be stronger. Or you'll become the sacrifice." A heavy silence hung between us. I didn't know whether to scream, to laugh, or to collapse completely. Behind us, Mateo groaned, pushing himself upright. He shuffled over, cradling his bleeding arm. He looked at me, then at Eileen, and managed a tired, crooked smile. "I guess you're one of us now, kid." I tried to laugh, but the sound came out as a strangled cough. Mateo lowered himself into a chair, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a stained rag. "I remember my first breach," he said. "Thought I'd die. Almost did." Eileen chuckled, a low, sad sound. "You still might." Mateo pointed a shaky finger at her. "Always the optimist, Eileen." The three of us sat there for a long time, the diner around us slowly returning to its grotesque, faded normalcy. The scent of burnt ozone and blood still lingered, mixing with the faint aroma of old coffee and cracked vinyl booths. Eventually, Eileen stood, her joints popping like brittle wood. She shuffled to the counter, rummaging under the register, and returned with a heavy brass key. She held it out to me. I stared at it, my heart thudding. "What's this?" She pressed it into my palm, her fingers curling around mine. "The master key," she said. "It opens every room. The supply sheds, the cellar, even room 9. I recoiled slightly at the mention of room 9, the forbidden room, the one the rules had warned about from the start. Eileen squeezed my hand harder, forcing me to meet her eyes. "You're the keeper now, Quinn. You hold the line, you maintain the rules. This place, it's yours as much as it's ours." A tremor ran through me. "I don't want this," I said, my voice thin and shaking. "I never asked for any of this." Eileen's face softened. "None of us did," she whispered, "but here we are." I looked at Mateo, hoping for some kind of reprieve, a sign that I could just walk away, but he only shrugged, his expression resigned and oddly gentle. "People like us don't get to walk away," he said. "We're tied to this place, to the echoes, to the debts." I turned the key over in my hand, feeling its weight. It was heavy, almost too heavy for something so small, but it wasn't just metal, it was responsibility, history, curse. Outside, the moon began its slow descent behind the dunes, painting the desert in shifting grays and silvers. The neon sign buzzed louder now, flickering like a dying star. I pushed myself up to stand, my legs wobbling. Every muscle screamed in protest, but I stayed upright. Elaine watched me with those ancient eyes, her lips trembling. Mateo just nodded once, as if this was the only answer he'd ever expected. I took a deep breath and looked at the key again. Somewhere in that silence, I felt the motel breathe, a low, deep pulse that thrummed in the walls and the floorboards and in my own chest. I realized then, the place wasn't just alive. It was waiting for me. I curled my fingers around the key and felt it warm slightly in my hand, as if it recognized me, accepted me. Without another word, I turned and stepped out into the hallway. The corridor stretched on forever, shadows pooling around the doorways like dark water. I passed room 6, my old temporary haven, then room 7, room 8. Finally, I stopped in front of room 9. I stood there for a long time, my hand hovering over the knob, the brass key burning in my palm. The door seemed to shiver under my gaze, as though something behind it was breathing, waiting, yearning. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I pressed my forehead to the wood and let the cold seep into my skin. I had stood once. I had held the line. But this was just the beginning. The desert beyond the motel was quiet again, for now, but I could still hear the faintest echo of that ancient hunger out there in the sand. And I knew, deep in my marrow, that it would come again, and next time it might not wait for me to be ready. I don't remember walking back down the hall. It felt like the motel itself was moving beneath me, breathing, stretching, shifting, the distance between rooms just a toy with me. Every step echoed like it was swallowed by something hollow and endless. The key in my pocket pulsed with each heartbeat, hot against my leg. I felt its presence, as though it was stitched to my flesh. A new organ I didn't ask for but could no longer live without. I paused in front of room 6, my temporary sanctuary, my first prison. I pressed my fingers against the cracked doorframe. The wood felt brittle, almost like old bone. Memories of that first night crashed back, the knocking at 3 a.m., the breathless terror in the dark, the instinct to run. But I hadn't run, not really. I moved on. Room 7's door was slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness oozed from the crack, like ink spilling slowly across a page. I stopped, hand hovering over the knob. A voice slithered out, soft and syrupy, curling around my neck. "Quinn!" I stepped back, heart hammering. "Come inside. Let me show you what you left behind." I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know. But the voice kept coming, sliding under my skin, into my lungs. Your mother, alone in her kitchen, crying at the sink. Your father's disappointed sigh as he packed away your childhood trophies. Your ex, deleting your messages, whispering that you were never enough. I turned and shoved myself away from the door, stumbling into the wall across the hall. My breath came in ragged gasps. My hands trembled as though they belonged to someone else. I had thought the collector was the real horror, the claws, the void face, the endless hunger, but this motel had other monsters, ones that wore my own failures like masks. I slid down the wall, my back scraping against the peeling wallpaper. My legs gave out, and I sat there in the hallway, staring at my shaking palms. The light above flickered, casting everything in an epileptic dance of shadow and glow. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the end of the hall, a dark shape ducking into a doorway, gone before I could blink. I pressed my forehead to my knees, trying to steady my breath. "You still breathing, kid?" Matea's voice snapped me back. I looked up and there he was, standing at the far end of the hall, a stained rag thrown over his shoulder. His face looked impossibly old in the flickering light, like a war monument eroded by decades of rain. "Yeah," I croaked. "Barely." He nodded and started limping toward me, each step slow and deliberate. When he reached me, he squatted down with a grunt, his knees cracking. "You don't have to open every door," he said. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, like he was speaking to a scared child. I shook my head. "But they're calling me." "Of course they are," he said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "That's what they do. They feed on guilt, on regret. They'll tell you anything to make you turn that key." He squeezed my shoulder hard enough to anchor me back to reality. "Listen to me," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "Once you open a door, you can't unsee what's inside. You think you can handle it, but the things behind those doors, they're made from pieces of you. Every failure, every betrayal, every moment you wished you were someone else." A tremor rolled through me, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. "In room 9? I asked. Mateo let out a shaky breath, his hand dropping away. "Room 9 is the heart, the wound that never heals. It's the reason this place stands, the reason it traps people like us. You open that door, and you'll either understand everything or lose yourself forever." I stared past him, down the dark corridor. "Is that what happened to you?" I asked. His face cracked, a deep sadness that seemed to hollow out his eyes. He stood, his shoulders slumping. "Maybe," he whispered. "Or maybe I just never had the guts to find out." He started back down the hallway, his steps echoing like slow, final heartbeats. I sat there alone for a long time, the motel groaning and shifting around me. I could almost feel it listening, breathing, waiting for me to make my next move. I pressed my palm against my pocket, feeling the heavy outline of the brass key. It throbbed like a curse, each pulse a silent dare. After what felt like hours, I finally pushed myself up. My legs felt like wet cement. My head spun, but I kept moving. I passed room 7 without looking inside, though the voice still coiled around me, promising love, forgiveness, warmth, lies, all of it. I stopped again at room 9. This time, I didn't touch the doorknob. I pressed my forehead to the cold wood, closed my eyes, and listened. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, a heartbeat, slow, deep, echoing up from beneath the floorboards, through the walls, into my bones. I stayed like that, my breath sinking to that pulse. I felt the motel shift, as if drawing me closer, whispering that I was so close to understanding. I pulled back, my fingers curling into fists. "Not tonight," I whispered. Somewhere behind the door, I swear I heard laughter, a low, wet chuckle that rattled the walls. I turned away, stumbling down the hallway, past all the other doors that promised nothing but pain. When I reached the lobby, Eileen was waiting, her eyes bloodshot and hollow. She looked at me like a mother seeing her child come home from war. "You didn't open it?" she said. I shook my head. She stepped forward, wrapping her thin arms around me. I stiffened at first, then slowly let myself collapse into her embrace. "You did good, Quinn," she murmured into my ear. "You did so damn good." I didn't believe her, but in that moment, I let myself pretend. As I held her, the key felt heavy in my pocket, like a ticking bomb. Tomorrow, I knew, the door would still be there. The whispers would still be there, and one day I would have to choose. But for tonight, I was still Quinn Avery. I was still standing, and that had to be enough. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the stiff, musty bed in room 6, the hallway light seeping in under the door, casting thin, pale lines across the floor like prison bars. The motel was too quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a mausoleum is quiet. Every so often I thought I heard a floorboard creak outside my door, or a soft sigh slip through the vents. Each sound felt like a hand brushing just inches from my face in the dark. At some point I sat up, drenched in sweat, my throat tight. I pulled the key from my pocket and stared at it, turning it over and over in my trembling hands. The brass surface felt alive, pulsing faintly, as if echoing a heartbeat buried somewhere far below the motel floor. I pressed it to my forehead, my skin prickling at the cold metal. "You can't hide forever," a voice hissed in the back of my mind. "You know what's waiting. You know who you really are." I dropped the key, and it hit the floor with a heavy clink that felt louder than a gunshot. I shot to my feet, every nerve on fire. I needed air, space, something real. I shoved open the door and stepped into the hallway. The light above flickered, buzzing angrily like a swarm of trapped hornets. I moved fast, past the numbered doors, past the rules etched into my memory. When I burst into the lobby, I found Eileen sitting in her worn armchair, staring at the static-filled TV screen. Her eyes were glassy, vacant, as if she'd been sitting there for hours, or maybe days. She didn't look up when I entered. I stood there, panting, unsure whether to speak or run. Finally, she turned her head slightly, her voice flat and hollow. "Couldn't sleep?" I shook my head. She gave a humorless chuckle. "None of us really sleep. We just wait for the next breach, the next scream, the next lie we have to swallow." I stepped closer, the floor creaking under my weight. "Why me, Eileen? Why any of us?" She finally met my eyes. "Because we carry it inside us," she whispered. "The cracks, the wounds, we're already broken before we ever get here. That's how the motel finds us." She looked back at the TV, the static glow dancing across her hollow face. "The desert doesn't just call the lost," she continued. "It calls the willing, those who want to vanish, to dissolve into something bigger than their grief. The collector offers that. A final erasure, a mercy in its own twisted way." I felt my breath catch. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her she was wrong. But another part, a deeper, uglier part, understood exactly what she meant. We were all secretly wanted to be caught. I turned away from her and pushed out into the night. The desert air hit me like a slap, sharp, cold, full of dust and ghosts. The motel sign buzzed behind me, casting a sickly orange halo onto the cracked parking lot. I staggered forward, my feet scraping against the gravel. Somewhere far out in the dunes, a coyote howled, a long, mournful note that made my skin crawl. I collapsed next to the old gas pump, my knees hitting the ground hard enough to rattle my teeth. I pressed my forehead to the rusted metal, my fingers digging into the dirt. The sky above felt too big, too endless. The stars looked like shattered glass scattered across a black sea. I thought of my father, his silence, the way he would disappear into his garage for hours, returning with oil-smeared hands and eyes that refused to meet mine. I thought of my mother, her quiet sobs in the kitchen late at night, the way she pressed trembling fingers to her lips, as if trying to hold in every question she never dared to ask. I thought of every door I had closed, every escape I had chosen instead of facing what waited for me. The motel hadn't trapped me. I had built it, brick by brick, every regret and lie a new hallway, a new door. I let out a hoarse, broken laugh that turned into a sob. Above me, the moon watched, pale and scarred, a patient witness to my unraveling. A crunch of footsteps snapped me back. I turned and saw Mateo standing behind me, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. He didn't speak, just watched me for a long moment. Then he moved forward, lowering himself next to me with a groan. He leaned his back against the gas pump, pulled a cigarette from his pocket, and lit it. The smoke curled upward, pale ribbons disappearing into the night. After a few drags, he handed it to me. I hesitated, then took it, inhaling deeply. The smoke burned my lungs, but it felt good, sharp, grounding, real. We sat in silence, passing the cigarette back and forth. Finally, Mateo spoke, his voice low and tired. "You think too much, kid. That's your problem." I let out a shaky breath, the smoke dancing in the air. "You don't?" He laughed softly. "Oh, I think. I just learned a long time ago not to let it eat me alive." I looked at him, at the deep lines on his face, the old scars on his arms, the haunted weight in his eyes. "How long have you been here?" I asked. He shrugged. "Long enough to forget why I came in the first place. Long enough to realize the place isn't a prison. It's a mirror." His words hit me like a fist. I lowered my head, closing my eyes. A soft breeze stirred the dust, carrying with it faint echoes, whispers I almost recognized. I opened my eyes and looked at Mateo. "What if I can't do it? What if I fail?" He flicked the cigarette away, the ember arcing into the dark. "Then you fail," he said, "and the world ends for us. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just finds another poor bastard to carry the torch. But you'll never know until you stop running from yourself." I let the words sink in, heavy, unforgiving. True. I stood slowly, my legs shaky but steady enough to hold me. Mateo stayed on the ground, watching me with a tired, approving nod. I turned toward the motel, the key in my pocket suddenly feeling less like a curse and more like a weapon. For the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a guard. In the desert, it could wait. The desert wind followed me back inside the motel, trailing behind like a dying breath. The door slammed shut on its own, rattling the frame so hard I thought the glass would shatter. I stood in the lobby, my chest heaving. The air felt heavier than before, thick as oil. The neon sign outside flickered and hissed through the blinds, throwing warped shadows across the floor. Eileen was gone. Mateo, too. I felt alone in a way that went beyond physical space, like the building had swallowed them, or maybe I had stepped into another layer of the motel, one meant only for me. I took a hesitant step forward, my boots sticking slightly to the worn linoleum as though the floor itself was trying to hold me in place. The hallway ahead yawned open, impossibly long, each doorway gaping like a mouth mid-scream. A low hum vibrated through the walls, the same deep, echoing pulse I had felt through the brass key. I slipped my hand into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around it. The metal felt hot again, throbbing in sync with my heartbeat. The motel felt alive, watching, listening, and it wanted something. I moved down the hallway slowly, passing each numbered door. Room 6, Room 7, Room 8. Each one whispered to me in voices that sounded like every version of myself I had ever hated. The coward, the liar, the failure. Come inside. Remember who you really are. Remember every time you let them down. My hand brushed each doorknob, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I reached room 9, my feet froze. The door looked different tonight. The wood was darker, slick with something that shimmered in the flickering light, like tar or old blood. The brass number 9 seemed to twitch when I looked directly at it, as if trying to crawl off the door entirely. I pressed my forehead against it again, my breath fogging the surface. Behind it, I heard the low thud of a heartbeat. "Gwen," the voice sounded deeper tonight, older, like it had been echoing through canyons for centuries. "Open the door. See the truth. Accept what you are." My hand moved almost on its own, sliding the key from my pocket. I held it up, the metal gleaming in the sickly hallway light. I hesitated, every muscle screaming at me to stop, to turn around, but I couldn't. I slid the key into the lock. The click was deafening. The door swung open just a crack, and a cold wind spilled out, snaking around my ankles, curling up my spine. I pushed it open further and stepped inside. The room beyond wasn't a room at all. It was a void. An endless, starless ocean stretching forever in every direction. Black waves rolled beneath a sky that looked like it had been stitched from old wounds, scarred and gaping. In the center stood a figure, tall, draped in robes of shifting shadows. Its face was a mirror. When I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. I saw every moment I had ever wanted to erase. My mother, alone and weeping in the kitchen. My father, wordless, turning away. My ex, screaming that I was worthless, that I'd never be enough. Every job I had quit. Every door I had slammed shut. Every night I had crawled into bed, praying to disappear. I fell to my knees, my stomach lurching. The figure moved closer, gliding rather than walking. When it spoke, it sounded like every voice I had ever loved and every voice I had ever betrayed. You built me, Quinn. You called me here. You gave me shape, face, hunger. You are not the guard. You are the wound. I shook my head violently. No, I didn't. The figure bent down, its mirror face inches from mine. You did. And now, you will finish what you started. It extended a hand, long gnarled fingers wrapped in darkness. In its palm I saw the motel. The hallways stretched into infinity, each door pulsing like a dying star. I saw Eileen curled in her chair, her eyes empty. I saw Mateo, alone in the kitchen, holding a knife to his own trembling wrist. I saw myself, standing at room 9 again and again and again. Endless versions of me, each one weaker, each one falling to their knees. The figure closed its hand into a fist. A wave of pain slammed into me, sharp and blinding. My ribs felt like they were shattering, my skull like it was splitting open. I screamed, the sound echoing into the void and coming back twisted, warped, as if hundreds of other Quinns were screaming back at me. The figure leaned in closer, its breath like rotting leaves and cold ashes. You can end it all, Quinn. In the motel, in the echoes, in yourself. One choice, one key. I looked down and realized I still held the brass key, now warped and blackened, its surface crawling with cracks like dry earth. I could feel its promise, oblivion, silence, an end to the cycle. I raised it shakily, the darkness roaring in approval, the void around me trembling. Then, somewhere deep inside, a memory flared. My father's rough hands lifting me to sit on the roof of our house during a summer storm. The rain hammering down, the world electric and alive. He had pointed to the sky, his voice deep and steady. Bravery isn't not being afraid, kid. It's standing there anyway. The figure recoiled slightly, as if it could feel the memory burning through the void. I tightened my grip on the key, but instead of driving it into my own chest, I turned and drove it into the floor. The void shuddered. The figure screamed, a sound that cracked the sky and split the dark ocean beneath us. Light exploded from the key, flooding the room, burning away the shadows, the echoes, the endless mirrors of my failures. I fell backward, blinded and gasping as the void crumbled into dust. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in room 9. The door swung gently on its hinges, the hallway beyond eerily silent. I had chosen to stand, and for now the motel stood with me. When I finally crawled out of room 9, my entire body felt like it had been dragged across broken glass and left out to dry under a desert sun. The hallway was silent. The lights above flickered weakly, casting long shadows that stretched and recoiled as I moved. My fingers scraped along the wall, leaving smears of blood and sweat in my wake. My mind was a haze, fragments of that void still echoing inside me. The figure's mirror face, the endless reflections of myself, each one more pathetic than the last. I wanted to collapse, to let the floor swallow me whole, but the motel wouldn't let me. I felt it in the walls, under the floorboards, thrumming in the bones of the building like a massive, tired heartbeat. The motel wasn't just a structure, it was an organism, and I was now part of its nervous system. Somewhere down the hallway, I heard a door creak open. I forced myself forward, stumbling past the numbered doors, each one breathing faint whispers at me. When I reached the lobby, Eileen was there, standing perfectly still in front of the window. The moonlight hit her like a spotlight, making her look almost translucent. She turned to face me slowly, her eyes wide and glimmering, as though she were seeing a ghost. "My God," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You went inside." I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. I managed a shallow nod. Eileen's face collapsed into something between relief and horror. She stumbled forward, her hands hovering just inches from my shoulders, as if she was afraid touching me might burn her. "What did you see?" she asked, barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth, but the words choked in my throat. I didn't know how to describe it. The void, the mirror, the memories, the choice. Instead, I collapsed into her arms. She caught me awkwardly, her thin frame trembling under my weight. For a moment, we stood there, locked in an embrace that felt more like a funeral rite than comfort. "You did what none of us ever dared," she whispered against my ear. "You looked into the heart of it. You faced yourself." I pulled back, my eyes finding hers. "What? What am I now?" Her lips trembled. "You are the new anchor, Quinn. The boundary. You are what keeps the collector and the echoes from spilling over." I staggered back, the words echoing in my skull. No, that can't be me. I'm no savior. I'm not strong enough." Eileen shook her head sharply, grabbing my face between her cold hands. "Strength isn't about purity. It's about choice. You chose to stay. You chose to fight." Behind her, the static-filled TV sparked to life on its own. The screen twisted with images. Desert storms, endless highways, broken faces pressed against glass, eyes wide with terror. Mateo appeared in the doorway to the diner, leaning heavily against the frame. His eyes looked darker than before, as though he'd aged 20 years in a single night. He limped toward us, his breath ragged. "We felt it," he said, voice like gravel. "The whole place felt it." The collector's grip weakened. "The drifters are pulling back into the desert." I looked at him, my vision swimming. "Then it's over?" Mateo's laugh was sharp and sad. "It's never over. You just pushed it back, delayed it, but the motel, it will always call to the lost. And they'll keep coming. Oh, and you'll keep standing here, holding the line." A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. I doubled over, my stomach convulsing. Black bile splattered onto the floor. It shimmered under the buzzing lights, writhing for a second before evaporating into a thin mist. Eileen rubbed my back, her touch gentle and almost motherly. "You're purging," she said, softly. "Let it out. Every echo that tried to take root in you, every whisper from the void." I spit another mouthful of blackness onto the floor, gasping for air between retches. When it was finally over, I sank onto my knees, trembling. Eileen knelt beside me, wiping my mouth with a frayed rag. Mateo sat cross-legged a few feet away, watching with tired, resigned eyes. We sat like that for a while, the silence punctuated only by my ragged breathing and the low buzz of the neon sign outside. Finally, Eileen spoke. "You know what this means now, don't you?" I nodded weakly. "I can't leave," I said. The words tasted like rust. "I can't ever leave." She placed a thin, cold hand over my heart. "You're not a prisoner, Quinn. You're the gatekeeper. You decide who enters, who passes, who stays." I felt my chest tighten, the finality of it crushing me. Mateo stood with a groan, moving toward the lobby door. He paused, looking back at me. "I've stayed too long," he said. "This place, it needs a new blood to hold the line, and now it has it." My head jerked up. "Where will you go?" He shrugged, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Wherever the desert takes me. Maybe I'll finally find my way beyond the dunes. Maybe I'll just become another echo. Doesn't matter anymore." He stepped outside into the moonlight, his silhouette shrinking until the night swallowed him whole. I wanted to call after him, to tell him to stay, but no sound came out. Eileen stood, brushing the dust from her knees. She turned to me, her eyes wet but proud. "My time is ending too," she said. "I've held this place together for as long as I could. But tonight you proved it can endure without me." I shook my head, panic rising. "Don't leave me, please." She smiled softly, brushing my hair back like a mother soothing a fevered child. "You won't be alone. You have the motel. You have every echo, every heartbeat in these walls. And you have yourself, finally." She leaned forward, pressing her lips to my forehead. The kiss burned, a final blessing and a final curse all at once. Then she turned, moving toward the hallway. Her steps were slow but certain, as if she had been rehearsing this exit for decades. I watched her disappear into the darkness, her shape swallowed by the shifting shadows, until only silence remained. I stayed there on my knees, my hands pressed into the cold, stained floor. In that quiet, I felt it, the motel's pulse merging with mine. The boundary breathing through me, the infinite doors waiting. And somewhere deep inside, under the terror, under the exhaustion, a new fire sparked. I was still here, still standing. And for tonight, that was enough. I don't know how long I stayed kneeling on that cold, cracked lobby floor after Aileen vanished into the dark hallway. Minutes, hours, time had dissolved into something formless, the way a dream melts in the morning light. I pressed my hand against the floorboards. It felt like I was touching the motel's pulse directly, a slow, deep thrum that vibrated into my bones. The boundary wasn't just around me anymore. It was inside me. I finally pushed myself up, my legs shaking. Every movement felt heavy, as though the air itself had turned to tar. The neon sign outside buzzed, sputtered, and then went dark. For a moment, an oppressive silence swallowed everything. Then, the motel exhaled. A low groan echoed through the walls, as if it were stretching after a long sleep. The hallway lights flickered back to life, though their glow now felt different, weaker, older, like tired eyes trying to stay open. I stood alone in the lobby. No Eileen, no Mateo. No one left to guide me. I turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The dusty counter, the static-filled TV screen, the stack of guest check-in cards yellowed and curling at the edges. I was the only heartbeat left. A distant knock echoed down the hallway. Soft at first, almost polite. I turned sharply, my hand going instinctively to the pocket where the key had once been. But the key was gone, absorbed into me, or maybe into the motel itself. I stepped toward the hallway, my breath shallow and sharp. The knock came again. 3 slow raps. Then silence. I moved past room 6, room 7, room 8. When I reached room 9, I stopped. The door was ajar, just a sliver of darkness spilling out like black smoke. I didn't dare touch it, not yet. Another knock. This time it came from the lobby door behind me. I turned slowly. A figure stood on the other side of the glass, barely illuminated by the pale moonlight. A tall silhouette, shoulders hunched, head tilted in a way that felt painfully familiar. For a moment, my stomach dropped into a black pit. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing the cold glass. The figure looked up. Its face was smudged, like an old photograph left out in the rain. But beneath the distortion, I recognized something. The slope of the jaw, the curl of the hair. My father, or something wearing his shape. My breath caught in my throat. My father had been dead for years, a slow death in a dark garage full of cheap whiskey and unfinished apologies. But here he was. He lifted a hand and pressed it against the glass. "Quinn," he said, his voice muffled and broken, as though coming from underwater. "Son, let me in." Every instinct screamed at me to run, to slam the door, to hide, but I stood frozen, my hand lifting toward his almost without thought. "Please," he said again. "I'm so cold out here." Memories crashed through me like a storm. The long silences at the dinner table, the reek of bourbon in the hallway, the slurred curses on Christmas Eve, but also the other moments. His rough laugh when he fixed my bike, the pride in his eyes the first time I learned to swim, the night he held me on the roof during that summer storm. I pressed my palm against the glass, inches from his. For a moment, we just stood there, divided by that thin sheet of glass and an ocean of regret. Then I felt it, the motel stirring inside me, the pulse growing sharper, more urgent. He is not your father. The thought wasn't in words. It was a raw truth vibrating in my marrow. I pulled my hand back as though the glass had scorched me. The figure on the other side began to warp, its head twisting at an impossible angle. The eyes bled into the cheeks, the mouth melting into a gaping void. It slammed both hands against the door, the glass rattling under the force. "Let me in!" it shrieked, its voice splitting into a chorus of 1,000 dying echoes. I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the counter behind me, the air filled with the scent of rot and burnt hair. The thing pounded on the door, faster and faster, each hit cracking the glass like spider webs crawling across ice. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The lobby fell silent again, except for my own ragged breathing. I inched forward, peering through the now shattered glass. The figure was gone. Beyond the door, the desert stretched out, calm and endless under the moonlight. The sand looked almost peaceful, as though none of it had just happened. I turned back into the motel, my body shaking violently. I realized then this was my new life. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I wasn't a stray looking for an exit. I was the threshold, the one who decided who entered, who stayed, who passed beyond. The motel's heartbeat pulsed stronger now, each throb echoing in my ribs. I felt its hunger, its grief, its eternal vigilance. I took a deep breath, wiping the sweat and tears from my face with the back of my sleeve. I looked down the hallway at the endless doors waiting. Somewhere in the dark, echoes stirred. They would come, again and again, wearing the faces of my past, my regrets, my loves and failures, and each time I would have to stand. I closed my eyes, feeling the motel's breath merge with my own. When I opened them, I felt steadier. A little. I moved back toward the hallway, stepping over shards of glass, listening to the quiet hum of the walls. Room 9's door was now completely closed again. I pressed my hand against it gently. "We're not done yet," I whispered, "but I'm still here." And for that one moment, that single, fragile heartbeat in an endless night, I felt something close to peace. I didn't know what time it was when I heard the next knock. There were no clocks in the motel, and the desert moon outside seemed frozen in place, hanging low and swollen like an infected eye. I had just finished sweeping up the shattered glass in the lobby when it came. 3 knocks. Slow. Heavy. Each one felt like a hammer blow against my chest. I stood perfectly still, my broom still in hand. My breath fogged in the cold air, each exhale sharp as broken glass. The knock came again. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. This time, the sound didn't come from the front door. It came from deeper inside. From the hallway. I dropped the broom, the wood clattering against the floor. My fingers curled and uncurled, tingling with adrenaline. I stepped forward, each footfall echoing louder than it should. The hallway lights flickered above me, casting epileptic flashes across the doors. Room 11. I stopped in front of it. The door looked different tonight, the wood warped and sweating, as though it were alive and breathing heavily. Another knock, from inside. I pressed my ear to the door. A faint, trembling whisper drifted through the wood. "Please, help me." The voice was soft, brittle, like a matchstick about to snap. Against every instinct screaming in my skull, I reached for the handle. The door swung open on its own before I touched it. Inside, the room was dark except for a single flickering lamp in the corner. The shadows pooled thickly in the corners, moving as though they had a pulse. On the bed sat a figure, hunched and shivering violently. Their long hair fell forward like a curtain, hiding their face. I stepped inside, my body trembling. The door snapped shut behind me with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice so small it felt like it belonged to someone else. The figure didn't answer at first. They just rocked back and forth, letting out shallow, broken gasps that sounded like sobs. Finally, they lifted their head. It was a woman. Her face was pale and drawn tight across her skull, her eyes sunken and red-rimmed. Cracks split her cheeks and forehead, as though her skin were dry clay. Her lips trembled as she looked at me. I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. I felt the urge to back away, to run, but my feet stayed rooted. She reached out a hand, and I saw her fingers were long and skeletal, ending in cracked, blackened nails. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I don't want to forget. I don't want to become one of them." A cold dread seeped into my bones. "One of what?" I asked, though I already knew. "The echoes," she sobbed. "The drifters. I hear them in the walls. I see them in my dreams. They tell me to let go, to drift into the dunes." She pulled at her own hair, chunks of it coming away in her shaking hands. "I don't want to go," she cried, eyes wild. "Please, Quinn, please help me." I staggered back, my mind spinning. She knew my name. "How do you know me?" I demanded, my voice rising. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words dissolved into a strangled, inhuman wail. Her jaw unhinged, splitting impossibly wide, revealing a dark tunnel that seemed to go on forever. From deep inside her throat, hands clawed forward, pale, writhing fingers grasping at the air, pushing out as though trying to escape her. The room shook violently. The lamp shattered, plunging us into darkness. The hands kept coming, dozens of them, tearing at her from the inside. Her body convulsed and bent backward at an impossible angle, her bones cracking like dry twigs. I stumbled toward the door, fumbling blindly in the dark. My fingers found the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The woman's body finally split open down the middle, a spray of black ichor splattering across the walls. From her hollow chest cavity, a figure crawled out, a mass of arms, all connected at the shoulders, writhing and clawing over one another. Their heads, if you could call them that, were nothing but smooth stumps, mouths stretched wide in eternal scream. They lunged toward me, dragging themselves across the floor with sickening speed. I slammed my shoulder into the door, once, twice. On the third try, it gave way. I spilled out into the hallway, landing hard on my side. The thing reached the doorway, its many hands slamming into the frame, fingers cracking and bending as they tried to pull it through. But it couldn't cross. The motel held it back, its threshold acting like an invisible wall. The creature shrieked in frustration, its voices merging into one endless, deafening roar. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled backward down the hallway, my eyes locked on that writhing mass of flesh and claw. Finally, the creature retreated, slithering back into room 11. The door slammed shut behind it, sealing with a heavy finality. I stood there in the hall, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. My skin felt like it was crawling off my bones. Somewhere behind me, I heard a door open softly. I spun around, expecting another nightmare. Instead, I saw room 6's door slightly ajar, a soft, warm light spilling out. I approached slowly, peering inside. The room was empty, but on the bed sat a single object, the brass key. It gleamed faintly, as though it had been waiting for me all along. I stepped inside, picked it up, and felt the motel's pulse sync with mine again. I understood then. The key would always return to me. Every breach, every echo, every door, they were all mine to face, alone. I closed my eyes and took a shaky breath. When I opened them, I felt that same ember deep inside me, fragile but burning. I stepped back into the hallway, the brass key heavy in my hand, and looked toward the endless stretch of doors. I was still standing, and tonight, that was enough. I don't know what finally made me move. Maybe it was the echo of that woman's scream still rattling around my skull, or the lingering stench of black ichor burning my throat. Maybe it was the key pulsing in my hand like a second heart, demanding I keep going. Whatever it was, it pushed me out of room 6 and back into the hallway. I took my first step forward and felt the floorboard shift beneath me, like stepping onto the back of something alive. Each creak sounded like a rib cracking under pressure. The lights above flickered in and out, throwing the corridor into a sick rhythm of brightness and shadow. I paused in front of room 10. The door looked swollen, as if something behind it had been pushing against it for too long. Faint scratches clawed across the surface, deep enough to splinter the wood. I didn't dare touch it, not yet. Instead, I kept moving toward the far end of the hall, where a door I had never noticed before now stood ajar. A cold draft flowed from the opening, carrying with it a smell of wet earth and rotting flowers. I stepped closer, the key heavy in my pocket, tugging at me like a chain. I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. It wasn't a room at all. It was a stairwell, spiraling down into a darkness so deep it looked like an open wound in the earth. The walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper that peeled away in long strips, revealing something underneath, a pulsating black membrane like the inside of a living creature. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around. But I knew there was no turning back. I descended slowly, one step at a time. The further down I went, the more the air thickened. My breaths turned shallow and labored, each inhale tasting like damp soil and mold. The walls began to whisper. At first, it was too soft to make out, just a low hum beneath my heartbeat. But as I moved deeper, the words grew clearer. You were always going to end up here, Quinn. You think you're strong, but you're just meat for the threshold. No one will remember your name. The voices came from everywhere at once, above, below, behind my eyes. I pressed my hands against the walls to steady myself, feeling them quiver under my touch. Something moved beneath the membrane, pressing back, a shape that skittered and writhed away when I tried to focus on it. My knees buckled, and I fell forward onto the stairs. The voices rose into a frenzy. Coward, run away again. It's what you're best at. Let us in. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the bile back down my throat. I'm not running, I hissed through clenched teeth. The whispers paused for a heartbeat, then shifted into a low, mocking laugh that rolled through the stairwell like thunder. I forced myself up, hands gripping the rusted railing. My sweat dripped down, leaving smudges on the walls that were quickly absorbed into the pulsating surface. I didn't know how long I'd descended. Minutes, hours, time here had no meaning. Finally, I reached the bottom. The stairwell opened into a vast, cavernous basement that seemed to stretch forever. A single, dim light bulb swung overhead, casting long, jerky shadows that crawled across the concrete floor like hungry animals. In the center of the room stood a table, old, scarred, covered in deep knife marks. On it lay dozens of small objects. Old keys, scraps of torn clothing, lockets, yellowed Polaroids. Each piece hummed with a sick energy that made my teeth ache. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning each object. A child's shoe covered in dried mud, a wedding ring twisted and blackened, a dog tag engraved with a name I almost recognized. Each item felt like a confession, a final surrender left behind by those who had come before me. Sacrifices offered to the motel in exchange for some hollow promise of escape or absolution. I reached out to touch the wedding ring, and a sudden, sharp flash of memory hit me. A woman standing at a motel window, her hand pressed to the glass. Her eyes were wide, terrified, as something on the other side clawed at the glass. She slipped the ring from her finger, whispering an apology I couldn't hear, before turning and walking into the hallway toward room 9. I jerked my hand back, gasping. The basement walls began to thrum, the same pulse that had merged with mine upstairs. I turned to leave, but the stairwell had vanished. In its place stood another hallway, narrow, walls lined with the same breathing membrane. The floor slanted slightly downward, drawing me deeper. The motel wasn't just a building, it was a labyrinth, a living entity, and I was inside its gut now. I felt the key in my pocket vibrate violently, as though it wanted to leap from me and bury itself in the ground. The walls whispered again. Keeper, judge, sacrifice. I took one step forward, then another. The hallway stretched on, endless. Doors appeared on either side, each one slightly ajar, leaking thin streams of dark fog. As I passed, shapes moved behind the doors, silhouettes pressed to the glass, fingers clawing, mouths stretching into silent screams. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, the hallway opened into a chamber, circular and vast, with walls lined in mirrors cracked and stained with old blood. In the center stood a pedestal. On it lay a mask, carved from bone, etched with symbols I didn't understand but somehow recognized. I stepped closer, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I understood then. The mask wasn't meant to hide me. It was meant to reveal me. To the motel, to the echoes, to every twisted thing waiting in the dunes beyond. I reached out, my fingers brushing the bone. The whispers stopped. In the sudden silence, my heartbeat roared. I lifted the mask slowly, feeling its cold weight. I held it up to my face, hesitated for just a moment. Then I slipped it on. The moment the mask touched my face, the world collapsed. It felt like plunging into an ice bath. A sudden, searing cold that flooded every nerve, every thought. My vision went white, then black, then exploded into 1,000 fractured reflections. I staggered back, arms flailing, but there was no ground to catch me. Only an endless abyss yawning beneath my feet. I felt myself falling, faster, faster. And then I landed. Not on solid ground, but in a space that felt like the inside of a dying star. The air was thick and humming, alive with whispers and static. The darkness here wasn't just absence, it was a presence pushing in on me from every angle. I looked down at my hands. They weren't mine anymore. Long, gnarled fingers ended in sharp black claws. My skin, or what used to be skin, was a patchwork of gray and deep red, as though something had flayed me open and stitched me back together wrong. I reached up to rip the mask away, but it was gone. Or maybe it had become my face. When I tried to scream, the sound came out warped and metallic, echoing endlessly through the void. Shapes emerged from the darkness around me, figures, tall, thin, their limbs too long, their movements jerky like broken marionettes. Their heads were blank ovals, featureless except for deep cracks leaking a slow, black ooze. They moved closer, encircling me. One stepped forward and tilted its head, studying me. "Welcome," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping across concrete. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't form words. Only a raw, guttural sound tumbled out, an echo of pain and confusion. "You are the new echo," the creature continued. "You have crossed the veil. You wear the face now." I shook my head violently. No, this wasn't what I chose. I was the guard, the line, the one who stood. But the creatures only moved closer, reaching out with spindly fingers that crackled with static. They touched my arms, my chest, my face, each touch sending sharp jolts through my entire being. Memories exploded behind my eyes. My mother, singing to me when I was 6, her voice soft and warm. My father, smashing bottles in the garage, shouting curses into the darkness. My first love, leaving with a suitcase, eyes hard and tired. Every door I slammed, every apology I never gave, every moment I looked away, the echoes pressed these memories deeper, twisting them, distorting them into something monstrous. In the dark, I saw a reflection, a pool of shimmering black liquid at my feet. I bent over it and looked. The face that stared back wasn't human. The bone mask had fused with my skull, its symbols glowing faintly like dying embers. Hollow eyes, endless and hungry, gazed up at me. I recoiled, stumbling back. "Accept," the voices chanted. "Accept, accept, accept." I clutched at my head, my claws tearing into my own scalp, thick black ichor oozing between my fingers. Through the pain, a single thought cut through like a knife. This isn't me. I dropped to my knees, the echo creatures closing in. their hands reaching, pulling, demanding surrender. But deep inside, beneath the noise and the terror, I felt something. A pulse, faint but steady. The motel's heartbeat. My heartbeat. I slammed my hands onto the ground, sending cracks splintering through the black surface. Light bled through, thin, bright lines like veins of lightning. The echoes shrieked, stumbling back, their bodies convulsing. I forced myself to my feet, the light growing stronger, climbing up my legs, through my chest, into my throat. I opened my mouth and screamed, not in fear but in defiance. The light burst outward, shredding the dark, the echoes, the void itself. The bone mask cracked, splintered, and then it shattered. I fell forward, collapsing into a blinding white space. When I came to, I was on the motel floor, back in room 9. My body was whole again, my hands my own, my face free. The air around me felt sharp and alive, carrying the smell of dust and ozone. I pushed myself up on trembling arms. The walls around me were quivering, as if the entire building had just taken a deep, rattling breath. I felt the key in my pocket again, heavy and warm. I reached in and pulled it out. The brass surface was cracked now, dark lines spidering across it, but it was still there. I clutched it to my chest, my heart pounding in rhythm with its slow, deep thrum. Outside the room, I heard soft footsteps. I staggered to the doorway and looked out. The hallway was empty. But then, movement at the far end. A figure stood there. It was Eileen. Or something wearing her shape. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes glowing faintly. Her face was lined and tired, but there was something gentler now, a softness that hadn't been there before. "You saw it," she said, her voice echoing slightly, like a sound in a deep well. "You wore the mask. You faced the echo." I nodded, my throat raw. "Then you understand," she continued. "This place, it isn't just a barrier, it's a mirror. And you are both keeper and kept, prisoner and warden." My knees buckled, but I stayed standing. "I'm not like them," I managed to choke out. She stepped closer and placed a cold hand on my cheek. "No," she whispered. "You're stronger. That's why you're still here." I felt a warmth blossom in my chest, painful and bright, like a cauterized wound. I didn't know if I would survive another breach, another echo, another mask. But in that moment, standing in the ruined hallway, key clutched to my heart, Eileen's ghostly fingers on my skin, I knew one thing. I was still me, and for tonight I had chosen to stay standing. I don't remember falling. One moment I was standing there with Eileen's ghostly hand on my cheek, feeling that flicker of warmth in my chest. The next I was on the floor, my body curled tight like a dying animal. The walls around me pulsed, the paint bubbling and cracking as if the motel itself was trying to breathe me in. The key, still clutched to my chest, seared into my skin, a brand I hadn't asked for, but could never remove. Eileen stood above me, her eyes glowing with that same pale, otherworldly light. She tilted her head, studying me like a wounded bird. "You're close now," she murmured. "So close to the center." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but my tongue felt too heavy, my throat too dry. She crouched down, her fingers brushing my hair, her touch sending icy shocks down my spine. "You think this place is a prison," she whispered, "but prisons have doors that lead out. This is a witness, a mirror to everything you are and everything you fear you might become." I tried to speak, but a sharp, searing pain lanced through my skull. My vision split into jagged shards, each shard showing me a different version of myself. Younger, older, twisted, empty-eyed. The hallway around me began to distort, stretching and spiraling like a fevered dream. I crawled forward on my hands and knees, dragging myself toward the end of the corridor. My fingers scraped across the warped floor, leaving trails of blood. Behind me, I heard Eileen's voice echoing in all directions. "Show him," she commanded. "Show him what he is." Doors began to slam open one by one, each explosion sending a shockwave through my bones. From each room, figures stumbled out, half-formed echoes with skin like wet paper and eyes hollow as dried wells. Their mouths gaped open, but no sound came out. They reached for me, their fingers twitching and clawing, nails clicking like insects on glass. I crawled faster, my breath ragged, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. Then I saw it. A door at the very end of the hall, taller and wider than the others, framed by a pulsating black-red light that spilled across the floor like a living wound. I pushed myself up onto trembling legs, staggering toward it. The echoes lunged, grabbing at my arms, my back, tearing at my clothes, my skin. Their touch felt like ice and fire all at once, burning straight into my marrow. I reached the door and slammed my palm against it. The surface was slick and warm, like skin stretched too tight. I felt something shift behind it, a deep, slow breath, as though the entire motel was inhaling. I pushed. The door swung open with a scream, a high metallic wail that clawed at my eardrums and rattled my teeth. Inside was darkness, a black so dense it swallowed every thought before it could form. I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. The echo's screeches cut off, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure on my chest. I stood alone in the void. I lifted the key in front of me. It glowed faintly now, its cracks pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. A voice came from the dark, deep and layered, like a choir whispering in unison. "Why do you continue?" I swallowed hard, my voice breaking. "Because I can't leave. Because I chose to stand." The darkness seemed to ripple, like something massive shifting just out of sight. "What are you guarding, Quinn?" I thought of Eileen, Mateo, the echoes that wore the faces of my regrets, the motel itself, alive and starving. "Me," I whispered, "I'm guarding me." The darkness laughed, a sound like bones breaking underfoot. "Then let us show you." Suddenly I felt hands on my shoulders, on my neck, on my face. I thrashed, but they held me firm, dragging me forward through the dark. In front of me a shape began to form, a mirror tall as a doorway, its surface rippling like black water. The hands forced me closer, until my face hovered inches from it. I looked. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't just me. It was every version of me I had tried to bury. The terrified boy hiding under the kitchen table while his father raged. The teenager smashing bottles behind gas stations, whispering empty promises to a dead sky. The young man staring at a motel ceiling, praying for an end he didn't have the guts to take. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths twisted into sneers. They pressed their hands against the inside of the mirror, their skin splitting, revealing raw, screaming muscle underneath. "Join us," they moaned in unison. "Become what you were always meant to be." I shook my head, tears blurring my vision. "No," I gasped. "I won't." They pounded on the glass, the sound like thunder cracking open my skull. "You already did. You already belong to us." I pressed the key against the mirror. It burned in my hand, smoke curling from my fingers. The glass began to splinter, long cracks racing across its surface. The echoes inside shrieked, clawing at each other, at me, at the walls of their prison. I screamed with them, the sound tearing out of me like a final confession. With one last surge of strength, I drove the key into the mirror. The glass exploded outward, shards flying past me, slicing into my skin. The darkness roared, collapsing inward, pulling the echoes with it. I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet. I fell and fell, until finally I landed on the motel lobby floor. I lay there, gasping, staring up at the flickering lights. My hand still clutched the key, now fused with my flesh, a permanent brand. The motel was silent around me, but I felt it, a new calm, heavy and solemn, like the hush before dawn. I didn't know if I had won. I didn't know if I was still whole, but I was still here, and that for tonight was enough. I don't know how long I lay there. My body felt like it was stitched together from shards of glass and rusted wire. Every breath scraped down my throat like sandpaper, each heartbeat echoing like a hammer inside my skull. Somewhere above me, the motel's ceiling creaked and groaned, as if the building itself was slowly waking from a bad dream. I tried to move. My fingers twitched first, then my wrists. I turned my head to the side and saw a smear of dark blood pooling beneath me. It was mine, that much I knew, but it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I forced myself onto my elbows, gasping. The key was still fused to my hand, the metal now darkened, veins of black and crimson snaking across my palm and disappearing into my skin. I tried to pull it free, but it wouldn't move. It pulsed once, sharply like a reprimand. I shivered and dropped my head. "Get up," I croaked to myself. My voice sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. I pushed to my knees, then staggered upright. My vision swam, edges flickering with ghostly after images. I turned in a slow circle. The lobby was different now. The old check-in counter had splintered, deep claw marks raked across its surface. The neon vacancy sign that once glowed above the doorway now lay shattered on the floor, its glass guts glittering like a spill of tiny stars. The air smelled of ozone and copper, the stench of violence, of something ancient and newly born. I staggered toward the hallway, my feet dragging. As I passed room 6, I saw that its door had been blown off its hinges. Inside, the walls were scorched black, handprints seared into the wallpaper like permanent shadows. Room 7's door hung open just enough for me to glimpse movement inside, something shifting just beyond the threshold, breathing in slow, shallow rasps. I didn't look closer. I couldn't. Further down, I reached room 9. The door was gone. In its place was a gaping maw, a hole that led into nothing but pitch-black silence. A cold draft curled out, brushing my face like a whisper. I felt the key in my hand throb, almost as if it were hungry. I stepped back, my stomach twisted. "You're part of this now," a voice said. I turned sharply. Yulni stood at the far end of the hallway, her form wavering like heat rising off asphalt. Her face was softer now, younger, but her eyes glowed with the same endless sadness. "This place, it reshapes itself after every breach," she said, stepping closer, her bare feet silent on the splintered floor. "The motel is alive, Quinn, and it's yours to feed or to starve." I shook my head, stumbling back. "I didn't ask for this." Her expression softened. "None of us did." She reached out a hand, stopping inches from my chest. "But you chose to stand when every part of you wanted to run. You chose to see it all and still remain. That choice, that is the only thing that makes you more than an echo." My breath came fast, ragged. I wanted to believe her, but the images of the echoes clawing at the mirror, the darkness swallowing me, were still too fresh, too raw. She let her hand drop. "You are the line now," she said, "the barrier. Every soul that knocks will be judged by you. Every room, every corridor, they all answer to you now." I looked at my fused hand, the black veins crawling up my wrist. "I can't. I don't know how." She tilted her head, her glowing eyes softening. "Then learn, or this place will consume you, and the world beyond it." The hallway shuddered then, as if punctuating her words. A low rumble rolled under my feet, and I felt the walls tighten, contracting like lungs exhaling. A new sound rose from the end of the hall, a slow, rhythmic knocking. 3 times. A silence. Then 3 more. Island's form began to fade, dissolving like mist at sunrise. Her voice echoed one last time. "Answer the door, Quinn." I turned toward the noise, my body moving almost without my permission. At the end of the hallway stood a door I had never seen before. Its surface shimmered as if it were made of black glass, and behind it I could sense something immense, shifting. A presence so vast it pressed against the edges of my mind, threatening to split me open. I moved forward, each step heavy, the key burning against my flesh. When I reached the door, I stopped, my breath shaking. I raised my hand and pressed it to the surface. It was cold, so cold it felt like it might freeze my bones from the inside out. The knocking stopped. A voice, soft as silk but echoing with 1,000 layered tones, drifted out from behind the door. "Keeper," it whispered. "Will you open? Will you let us through?" I leaned closer, my forehead pressing to the door, my eyes squeezed shut. "No," I whispered. The voice laughed, a low rumbling sound that vibrated through my teeth. "Then you will starve with us." I pulled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. I closed my fingers around the key, feeling it pulse in rhythm with the motel's breath. I turned and faced the hallway, the dozens of other doors waiting, each one hiding its own nightmare, its own secret. I took a deep breath. For the first time, I felt the boundary inside me settle, the chaos quieted. I knew then, I was the door now, the judge, the witness. And no matter how many times the darkness knocked, I had to be the one to answer. I clenched my fist around the key and took my first step forward into the new shift. The motel trembled, as if in approval. And somewhere deep inside, beyond the echoing horrors, a single thought burned bright and cold. I was still standing. The hallway felt longer than it had ever been. The doors on either side stood taller now, impossibly narrow, each one humming with a faint vibration that crawled into my bones. It felt like walking between two rows of graves, each door a headstone, each echo inside a ghost scratching at the coffin lid. I could hear them, some sob softly, begging in voices that sounded like water dripping in a drain. Others whispered promises, lies sweet as poison. A few simply breathed, slow and rattling, waiting for the moment I'd slip. I kept moving. My feet dragged across the warped floorboards, the splinters digging into my soles. The key pulsed in my fused hand, each throb syncing with the motel's heartbeat. I reached a junction where the hallway split into two directions, left and right. But down the center, a new door stood. It wasn't numbered, it wasn't even shaped like the others. This one was circular, almost like a vault door, made of rusted iron plates welded together. Deep grooves ran along its surface, and every few seconds they glowed red, as though something inside was breathing through the cracks. Carved into the center, in jagged, dripping letters, were the words, "The Ledger." I felt my knees buckle, my vision narrowed to a tunnel. I didn't want to know what was behind that door, but the motel wanted me to. The key pulsed again, a violent, sharp sting that spread up my arm and across my chest like wildfire. I staggered forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the door, I pressed my palm against it. The metal sizzled under my touch, smoke curling up around my fingers. I pushed. With a sound like a dying animal, the door swung open. A wave of heat slammed into me, carrying the stink of scorched flesh and wet earth. I stepped inside. The room beyond was vast, far larger than the motel should allow. Rows upon rows of tall iron shelves rose into darkness. Each shelf was crammed with thick, leather-bound books, some blackened and cracked, others slick with fresh, wet ink that dripped to the floor in sluggish streams. A narrow aisle stretched between the shelves, ending at a single, massive table. On it sat a ledger the size of a coffin. The cover was stitched together from what looked like human skin, the seams still raw and oozing. I moved forward, each step echoing in the cavernous space. When I reached the table, I placed my trembling hands on the ledger's surface. It felt warm, as if it had its own heartbeat. Slowly, I opened it. The pages inside were covered in names, each one scrawled in a language I almost recognized, twisted, angular letters that seemed to move if I stared too long. As I flipped through, some of the names shimmered, bleeding red ink that spread like veins across the parchment. Others faded as I touched them, their shapes dissolving into gray dust that drifted off the page. I found my own name. It was scrawled deep into a thick black smear that stretched across the entire page. When I touched it, I felt a sudden surge of images. My childhood bedroom lit by moonlight, my mother's tears, my father's shaking fists, every moment of shame and silence. I recoiled, stumbling back from the table. My head felt split open, as if 1,000 knives had been driven through it at once. A voice slithered out from behind me. "You see it now," it crooned. "Every soul that passed through these halls, every bargain struck, every door opened or slammed shut." I spun around. A figure stood in the aisle, tall and thin, wrapped in tattered cloth that writhed like it was alive. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but beneath the folds, I saw countless eyes blinking in and out of existence. "The ledger keeper," it said, as if answering a question I hadn't asked. "The true heart of this place." I staggered backward, my shoulder hitting the edge of the table. "I didn't ask for this," I choked out. It stepped closer, its movements impossibly smooth, like a shadow sliding across oil. "Neither did they," it whispered, gesturing to the endless shelves. "But the ledger demands names, stories, regrets." It reached out a long, bony hand, placing it on my chest. "You've given so much already. Pain, blood, choice. But you still have more to give." I felt the key in my hand twitch violently, sending a bolt of pain up my arm. "Stop," I gasped. "I won't give you anything else." The figure tilted its head, the eyes beneath the hood swirling faster. "It's not about giving," it crooned. "It's about recording. Every moment you survive, every time you refuse the door, every soul you deny. They all go here." It gestured to the ledger. I looked at it, my name still pulsing on the page, bleeding and shifting. "This is your burden now," it said. "You are no longer just the keeper. You are the witness, the scribe, the motel's living memory." I fell to my knees, my breath ragged. "No," I whispered. "I won't become this." The figure leaned down, its many eyes boring into me. "You already are," it murmured. Then it straightened and began to dissolve, its cloth unraveling into ash that drifted up into the black ceiling. I forced myself to stand, swaying. I looked at the ledger, at the endless rows of names, each one a life broken against the motel's hungry walls. I knew then that my story was no longer just mine. It was stitched into every corridor, every echoing knock, every trembling breath behind the doors. I closed the ledger with a shuddering slam. The shelves groaned, the books rustling as though sighing in unison. I turned and limped back to the vault door, each step burning into me like a brand. When I stepped out into the hallway again, I felt the motel settle around me, its walls vibrating softly like a purr. The key throbbed, fusing deeper into my flesh. I glanced down the endless corridor. More doors waited, more echoes, more names to record. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders, and I stepped forward. The hallway felt endless. Each step echoed like a gunshot in a canyon. My knees threatened to buckle, my back throbbed as though something heavy perched between my shoulder blades, riding me like a curse. I could feel the ledger in my mind now, every name, every door, every choice etched into me like scars under the skin. It weighed me down, thick and suffocating. I stopped in front of a new door. Room 23. I had never noticed it before. The number looked burned into the wood, charred and cracked, as if someone had branded it into the door with a hot iron. A slow, steady thumping came from the other side. A heartbeat. I pressed my forehead against the door, my breath fogging on the cold wood. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what waited. But the key pulsed again in my fused hand, a sick, eager throb. With a shudder, I turned the knob and stepped inside. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single, naked bulb swinging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with mirrors, hundreds of them, all shapes and sizes, mounted at crooked angles like a madman's gallery. Each mirror reflected me, but not the me standing there. Some showed me younger, naive, smiling, full of cheap bravado. Others showed me older, worn, eyes hollowed out and teeth filed to points. Some didn't look like me at all, twisted shapes that wore my face like a mask stretched too tight. My stomach lurched. The door slammed shut behind me. The mirrors began to tremble, tiny fractures racing across their surfaces like spider webs. I stepped forward, my boots crunching on shards of broken glass already littering the floor. In the largest mirror, dead center of the wall, a figure moved. At first, I thought it was just another reflection, but this one didn't match me. It moved on its own, twitching in short, stuttering bursts, like an old film reel catching on the sprocket. Its eyes locked on mine, hollow, deep, endless. It pressed its hands against the inside of the glass, its fingers spreading wide, skin cracking and splitting open to reveal black tendons writhing underneath. My breath froze in my lungs. Slowly, its lips parted and a sound crawled out, low, bubbling, like something drowning in mud. "Quinn?" I staggered back, tripping over my own feet, my spine slamming into a smaller mirror that shattered behind me. The figure in the glass tilted its head, studying me with that empty stare. "Let me out," it gurgled. "Let me wear you." I shook my head violently. "No, no." It pressed harder, the glass warping, bulging outward like the surface of a balloon stretched to bursting. I looked down at my hand. The key twitched and coiled. Hungry. The voice hissed again. "You're weak, Quinn. You always were. You ran from your father. You abandoned your mother. You left everyone to rot in your wake. You don't belong out there. You belong in here with us." Each word struck like a hammer to my chest. I pressed my palms to my temples, my knees buckling. "Let me out," the voice demanded, louder now, echoing off every mirror in the room. The other mirrors joined in, every twisted version of me chanting in that same distorted voice. "Let me out. Let me out. Let me out." The walls quaked. Shards of glass rained down around me, slicing into my arms and shoulders. Warm blood trickled down, mixing with the dust on the floor. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up, strangling me from the inside. The largest mirror bulged again. A black hand punched through, claws hooking into the air. Another hand followed, then a head, twisted and slick, a mockery of my own features, eyes like holes punched through flesh. I forced my body upright, stumbling forward. The key pulsed furiously, the veins along my wrist glowing a deep, angry red. I raised it, my hand trembling. The creature dragged itself halfway out of the mirror, ribs cracking as it forced its bulk through. "Join me!" it shrieked, voice rising into an unearthly screech that vibrated in my bones. I lunged forward and slammed the key into its forehead. The creature convulsed violently, black ichor spraying across my face. It let out one last shuddering wail before collapsing backward into the mirror. The glass spidered outward, cracks racing across every surface. I pulled the key free, stumbling back, gasping. The mirrors began to implode one by one, shards flying in every direction. Each shatter released a burst of air that sucked at my clothes and skin, pulling pieces of my fear, my regret, my memory away with them. When the last mirror exploded, the room fell silent. I stood alone, panting, blood dripping from 100 small cuts. My arms shook so violently I almost dropped the key. I looked down at it. The surface was now covered in black residue, its edges jagged like broken bone. The air around me felt clearer now, lighter, but hollow, as though something fundamental had been torn away. I turned slowly, stepping back toward the door. When I stepped into the hallway, the lights overhead glowed steady for the first time. A low rumble rolled through the walls, a deep, contented exhale. The motel was satisfied. For now. I leaned against the wall, sliding down until I sat on the floor. I pressed my forehead to my knees, my breath ragged. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and the echoing screams, I felt a spark. Small, flickering, but alive. I had faced myself. I had not run. When I finally lifted my head, I looked down the hallway at the other doors, waiting, each one promising another trial, another mirror, another monster. I clenched the key in my hand, my knuckles white. I stood, and for tonight, just tonight, that was enough. The hallway felt different now. The floorboards no longer groaned under my weight. The walls, once alive with whispers and breathy sighs, had gone silent. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the tense hush before a storm, a stillness heavy enough to crush your lungs. I moved forward slowly, each step measured, the key fused to my hand humming like a trapped hornet. I passed room 12, its door gone, nothing but a yawning black wound in the wall. A low wind drifted out from it, carrying the faint smell of old books and rotting flowers. I turned away quickly, my pulse roaring in my ears. Further down, I found another door. This one was different, taller, impossibly thin, carved from something that looked like driftwood but shimmered wetly under the hallway lights. Symbols covered its surface, moving if I stared too long, twitching, shifting like maggots under skin. A small plaque above it read, "The Deep Threshold." I swallowed, my mouth dry as sand. I didn't want to open it. Every cell in my body screamed to run, but the motel wasn't built for escape. It was built for revelation. Brutal, raw, final. I lifted my fused hand. The key pulsed eagerly, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. I pressed the key against the symbols. The door shuddered, then slowly creaked open, groaning like an old animal in pain. A thick black fog rolled out, coiling around my legs, slipping up my spine, whispering secrets in a language I could almost understand. I stepped through. The room beyond wasn't a room at all, it was a chasm. An endless drop spiraling down into nothingness. Platforms of twisted metal and rotted wood floated in the abyss, connected by narrow bridges made of bone and frayed rope. Somewhere far below, I heard something breathing, deep, slow, ancient. I stepped onto the first platform, the wood groaning under my weight. My hands trembled as I balanced, each footstep echoing into the black like a gunshot. I moved forward, crossing onto a bone bridge that swayed with each heartbeat. Shapes moved beneath me, shadows writhing just beyond the edges of my vision, eyes opening and closing in the dark, mouths moving in silent screams. Halfway across, I stopped. A figure stood on the next platform. It wore my face, but its eyes were pitch black, voids that devoured the dim glow of the chasm. Its smile was too wide, splitting its cheeks open into raw, gaping wounds. It tilted its head, studying me with childlike curiosity. "Quinn?" it said, voice echoing like wind in a crypt. "Did you think you were the only one?" I froze, my hands clenching into fists. "What are you?" It stepped closer, the bridge beneath my feet creaking dangerously. "I'm the echo you left behind," it purred. "The Quinn who ran, who surrendered, who let the darkness in and called it salvation." I shook my head. "No, that's not me anymore." Its grin widened, flesh tearing further, black ichor dripping down its chin. "But it was you, and it still is deep down. You can't cut me out. I'm stitched into you, every lie, every retreat, every terrified heartbeat in the dark." I felt my knees buckle. The bridge swayed wildly beneath me, ropes creaking and snapping. "You can't stand forever," it whispered. "One day you'll fall, and when you do, I'll be waiting." I took a trembling breath and stepped forward. The echo lunged. I ducked, my body moving on instinct. The echo's claws raked across the ropes, severing one. The bridge swung violently, nearly throwing me into the void. I grabbed a rope, fingers burning as the fibers tore into my palms. The echo hissed, scrambling across the swaying bridge with unnatural speed. I felt the key surge in my hand, heat radiating up my arm, into my ribs, my skull. I turned and slammed the key forward, striking the echo square in the chest. A deafening crack echoed through the chasm. The echo let out a shriek, its body contorting, limbs bending at impossible angles. Its mouth stretched wider, splitting its head open as black mist poured out, dissolving into the abyss below. For a moment, the bridge stilled. Then, silence. I stood there panting, the key still raised, my knuckles white. I looked down into the abyss, watching the last remnants of the echo vanish into the black. I didn't feel relief, only a cold, creeping emptiness. I turned and staggered forward. Crossing onto the next platform, my breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling with exhaustion. As I stepped onto solid ground, the chasm behind me began to close. The bridges crumbled into dust, the platforms cracking and falling away, swallowed by the void. I stood alone on the final ledge, a narrow corridor ahead of me carved into rough stone. I stumbled forward, leaning against the wall. At the end of the corridor, I saw a single door, a simple wooden door, unmarked. A warm glow seeped from beneath it, flickering gently like a candle flame. I pressed my forehead to it, my tears soaking into the wood. For a moment I felt something close to peace, fleeting, fragile, but real. I took a deep breath, fingers curling around the handle. I turned it slowly and stepped inside. The door swung open on a whisper. For a heartbeat, I thought I had finally stepped out of the motel's belly and into someplace real, someplace human. A single room stretched before me. Soft amber light pooled across a faded rug. The walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with worn paperbacks and framed photos, snapshots of lives I didn't recognize but somehow felt in my marrow. A small fireplace crackled gently in the corner, its glow casting lazy shadows that swayed like slow dancers. In the center of the room sat an old, overstuffed armchair, and in that chair, a figure. At first, I thought it was my father. The broad shoulders, the rough hands resting on the armrests, the shape of the head turned slightly toward the fire. My breath caught in my throat. I took a slow step forward. "Quinn," the figure said, its voice low and soft, like thunder buried under layers of blankets. I froze. The figure turned its head, and I saw the face. It was me. But not the twisted echoes, not the mirror demons, not the clawed things that had tried to drag me down. This was a version of me I almost recognized, older, lined with years I hadn't lived yet, eyes deep and warm, carrying the weight of choices made and roads not taken. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze sharp and impossibly gentle. "You finally made it," he said. My mouth worked silently before I managed to choke out a single word. "What is this?" He gestured to the room around us. "This is the room the motel doesn't want you to see. The one it hides beneath all the horror, beneath every echo and every nightmare. The core of you." I felt my knees buckle. I sank onto the rug, my fingers digging into the fabric as if I might fall through the floor at any moment. "Why show me this now?" I asked, my voice cracking. Older Quinn leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Because you've finally gone deep enough. You've shed the shells, fought the reflections, and faced the echoes. You've survived long enough to see yourself." My eyes burned. Hot tears spilled down my cheeks, dripping onto my trembling hands. "I don't want to do this anymore," I whispered. "I don't want to hold the line. I don't want to be the witness, the keeper, any of it." He smiled, and for a moment, I saw the boy I used to be in that smile. "None of us wanted it," he said softly. "But someone had to stand. Someone had to hold the door shut when everything else wanted to tear through." I shook my head, my body shaking. "Why me? Why not someone stronger? Someone whole?" He leaned back, eyes never leaving mine. "Because strength isn't about never breaking. It's about breaking and standing back up, even when everything inside you begs you to stay down." I pressed my forehead to the floor, sobbing. I felt his presence move closer. His hand rested on the back of my neck, warm and heavy. "It's okay to hate it," he said. "It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to want to run." I looked up at him, my vision blurred. "Then what the hell am I supposed to do?" He knelt beside me, lifting my chin with surprising gentleness. His eyes glimmered with something I hadn't felt in what seemed like lifetimes. Compassion. "You keep standing," he said. "You keep choosing. You keep holding the line because no one else can carry your story. No one else can hold the motel the way you can. You are its heartbeat now, its spine." I stared at him, my mind clawing for a way out, a loophole, anything. But there was only this. Only me. He placed his forehead against mine. I felt his breath, warm and steady. "You are enough," he whispered. Something inside me cracked then. Not like glass, but like ice thawing under spring sun. A warmth spread through my chest, painful and bright. I felt the motel's walls vibrating through me, its pulse merging with my own. The key in my hand pulsed once, twice, then settled into a slow, even rhythm. When I pulled back, the older me was smiling. Tears shimmered in his eyes too. "Now go," he said. "There are more doors waiting, more echoes to face, but tonight you've seen your center. Remember this when the dark comes knocking again." I stood slowly, my body somehow lighter and heavier all at once. He sank back into the chair, turning again toward the fire. As I moved toward the door, I looked back one last time. "Will I see you again?" I asked. He didn't turn, but his voice reached me, soft and final. "Every time you choose to stand." I stepped out into the hallway. The door closed behind me with a gentle click, the warmth fading, replaced again by the motel's cold, endless hush. But something was different. The hallway didn't feel as oppressive. The doors didn't whisper quite as loud. The shadows didn't claw so eagerly at my thoughts. I glanced down at the key fused into my hand. It no longer felt like a weapon or a curse. It felt like a heartbeat. I exhaled slowly, a shiver crawling down my spine. I turned, facing the endless row of doors. More echoes, more horrors, more choices. And I knew I would keep standing, because for the first time, I wasn't just holding the line for the motel. I was holding it for me. And for tonight, that was enough. The motel breathed like a living thing. Its pulse was slow, deliberate. A heartbeat that hummed beneath the floorboards, whispered through the cracked walls, and crawled like a fever through my veins. I stood in the lobby, the worn carpet beneath my feet fraying like the edges of my resolve. The key fused to my hand throbbed with a dull heat, a reminder of the burden I carried. The silence shattered with a knock. 1, 2, 3. I froze, my breath catching. The sound came from the far end of the hallway, that endless corridor of doors I had learned to fear and respect in equal measure. The knocks came again, steady and urgent, echoing through the hollow space. I swallowed hard and moved toward the sound, every nerve alive with tension. As I passed room 6, I heard faint whispers, the echoes stirring, voices laced with sorrow and anger. Room 7 was dark, the door hanging open, but nothing stirred inside. Room 8's light flickered, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. At the corridor's end, the source of the knocks became clear. Room 13. The door was old, its wood swollen and cracked. The number was barely visible, faded and chipped. I pressed my hand against the door, the key throbbing in response. The knock stopped. A silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. Then, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a figure shrouded in darkness. I stepped back, heart pounding. The figure moved forward. A woman, her face obscured by tangled hair, eyes shining with wet desperation. "Quinn!" she whispered, voice trembling. "I've been waiting." Her hands reached out, pale and shaking. I wanted to run, to slam the door shut and forget everything, but something rooted me to the spot. "You're one of us," she said softly. "One of the keepers, one of the broken." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. She smiled, a sad, crooked thing, and stepped aside. Inside, the room was small and cluttered. Photos lined the walls, faces frozen in time, eyes staring with silent pleas. A journal lay open on a cracked table, pages yellowed and stained. "This is my story," she said, voice barely audible. "And yours. And everyone's." I approached, reading the faded ink. Lines told of loss, regret, moments of courage and despair. Names I recognized, echoes I had encountered, stories I had lived. She sat beside me, tears tracing lines down her cheeks. "The motel remembers," she said. "It keeps our stories, our failures, our hopes, and it waits for us to face them." I closed the journal gently. The woman's gaze met mine, steady and unyielding. Are you ready, Quinn, to face your own echo? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the key, the motel, and my own fractured soul. I don't have a choice, I whispered, but I'm standing. She nodded, reaching out to clasp my hand. Together we rose, stepping into the dark corridor where echoes awaited, stories unfolded, and the motel's pulse never ceased. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the fire flicker, fragile but unbroken. The hallway stretched before me like a wound that refused to heal, long, dark, and pulsing with secrets I could feel in my bones. The echo's whispers followed me, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Some begged for mercy, others hissed accusations sharp as knives. I swallowed hard, clutching the key fused to my wrist. Its steady throb was the only thing grounding me in this spiraling nightmare. The woman who had led me here walked beside me, her steps light but sure. I felt the weight of her presence, a tether to the fragile humanity still clinging to this forsaken place. We stopped before room 14. The door was cracked open, revealing shadows shifting inside like restless spirits trapped between worlds. Are you ready? She asked softly. I nodded, even though my heart threatened to burst. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of old smoke and forgotten prayers. Figures emerged from the darkness, memories given form. There was a man, eyes hollow, clutching a faded photograph. His mouth moved silently, mouthing words I couldn't hear. A child stood nearby, clutching a worn teddy bear, its face streaked with tears that never fell. And then, a woman. Her eyes locked onto mine, fierce and accusing. You left me, she said, voice a razor slicing through the silence. You left me to drown in the silence. Pain tore through me like a physical blow. I wanted to scream, to beg forgiveness, to tell her I was sorry. But the words caught in my throat, tangled in guilt and regret. The echoes closed in, their voices rising into a haunting chorus that wrapped around my mind, pulling me into the depths. I fell to my knees, the weight of their sorrow crushing me. But the key pulsed fiercely, a beacon of light slicing through the darkness. I closed my eyes, reaching deep inside for the strength I thought I'd lost. The voices grew louder, but beneath them, I heard another sound, steady, unwavering, my own heartbeat. With a grunt, I forced myself upright. I'm here, I said, voice trembling but firm. I'm listening. The echoes paused, their faces softening, the anger melting into sorrow. The woman stepped forward, reaching out her hand. For the first time, she whispered, you've chosen to face us, not run. I took her hand, feeling the coldness of years of pain and loneliness. The room shifted then, the shadows dissolving into light. The man smiled sadly, the child's tears finally falling, the woman's eyes shining with something like hope. The woman squeezed my hand. You're healing the motel, healing us. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. The motel wasn't just a prison or a curse. It was a mirror, reflecting every broken piece of us, and every chance to become whole again. As we left the room, the hallway seemed less daunting, the whispers gentler. I knew the journey wasn't over, but for the first time I felt I might survive it. The weight of the motel settled on my shoulders like a shroud. Every breath felt labored, every heartbeat a drumbeat marking time in a world that had long since lost its rhythm. I stood before room 15, the threshold to silence itself. The door was heavy, carved from dark wood that seemed to drink in the flickering hallway light. It exuded a coldness so deep it pressed against my skin like ice. I could hear nothing beyond it. No echoes, no whispers, just a hollow, unnerving stillness. I pressed my palm against the door and it vibrated beneath my hand, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse that felt like a warning. A voice whispered in my mind, softer than a breath. This is the end of the line, Quinn. The last door. The final story. I took a deep breath, feeling the key throb fiercely in my fused hand. Slowly, I turned the handle. The door opened with a sigh, revealing a room bathed in shadows so thick they swallowed the edges of reality. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of cold stone and forgotten memories. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a final resonant click. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. I could feel it, the absence of sound, the void where voices and echoes once lived. In the center of the room stood a solitary figure. She was cloaked in white, her face obscured beneath a veil that shimmered like spider silk. Her presence filled the room with an oppressive calm like the eye of a storm. She reached out a hand, delicate and pale. I stepped forward, heart pounding against my ribs. "You have come far, Quinn," she said, voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I don't know if I can go further," I whispered. She smiled, a sad, knowing curve of her lips. "This is the edge of silence, the place where all stories end and all truths are laid bare." I swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of her words settle deep in my bones. "What happens here?" I asked. She gestured to the shadows around us. "Here, you will face the silence inside yourself, the parts you have buried, the voices you have drowned out. Only by embracing the quiet can you find the strength to stand when the echoes return." I felt a shiver crawl along my spine. The room seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting and coalescing into shapes, memories made manifest. I saw my childhood home, empty and dark. I heard the laughter of friends I had lost, the whispered betrayals, the silences that had grown between me and those I once loved. The woman in white stepped closer, her veil lifting to reveal eyes that reflected my own pain and hope. "You are not alone in this," she said softly. "The motel remembers every choice, every regret, but it also holds the promise of redemption." I closed my eyes, letting the silence wash over me like a tide. For the first time, I felt the weight begin to lift. Not gone, but softened, tempered by understanding. I opened my eyes and met hers. "I'm ready," I said. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through the veil of sorrow. The shadows dissolved into light, and the room brightened with a warmth that felt like dawn breaking after a long night. The door behind me creaked open, inviting me back into the motel's endless corridors. As I stepped forward, I knew the silence had changed me. It had carved away the fear, the anger, the guilt, leaving something stronger, something real. And though the echoes would come again and the motel would always hunger, I was ready to face whatever came next. Because I was no longer just a keeper of doors. I was a bearer of light, and for tonight, that was enough. The motel felt alive, not just the creaks and groans of old wood or the flicker of neon through cracked windows. It was something deeper, a pulse, a breath, a heartbeat that synchronized with my own. I stood in the lobby, the weight of the key burning in my palm like a brand. The silence was heavy, thick enough to drown in, and then a sound. Soft footsteps, slow, deliberate. I turned toward the hallway, the source of the noise. There, standing in the shadowed corridor, was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a long, dark coat that seemed to absorb the light. The face was obscured by shadow, but I knew it was me, or what I could become. I stepped forward, heart pounding. "Who are you?" I demanded. The figure's voice was low, rough, edged with something ancient. "I'm the guardian you'll become, the final echo, the last line between this place and the world beyond." A chill ran down my spine. "I don't want to be you," I said. The figure smiled, a slow, cruel curl of the lips. "You don't have a choice. The motel chooses its keepers. It demands sacrifice. And one day you'll understand." I shook my head, the key pulsing furiously in my hand. "I'll find another way." The figure laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "There is no other way." Suddenly, the walls began to pulse, the floor trembling beneath my feet. The motel was waking, the endless corridor stretched and twisted, doors opening and closing like hungry mouths. Shadows spilled out, shapes with eyes like burning coals and voices like the howl of the damned. I raised the key, the metal glowing red hot, the pain searing through my hand. The guardian stepped forward, merging with the shadows, becoming one with the darkness. "You must stand," it whispered, "for the motel, for the echoes, for yourself." The shadows lunged. I screamed, the sound ripping through the silence, a beacon in the endless night. And I stood. Hey everyone, thanks so much for sticking with me through this wild, twisted journey. Quinn's story is one of struggle, sacrifice, and the fight to stand when everything wants to pull you under. It's about facing your darkest fears and finding strength in the shadows. If this story spoke to you, if it made your heart race or your skin crawl, then that's why we tell these tales. To remind us that even in the darkest places, there's a flicker of light worth holding on to. Thanks for listening, for believing, and for being part of this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. I love hearing what you think, and who knows, maybe your ideas will inspire the next chapter. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your lights burning, and remember, sometimes the scariest battles are the ones we fight within. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story.